Good morning. I will call to order the June 8th COGCC regular hearing. First up on the agenda is roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bogue.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan. Here. Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins. Mr. Chair, you have 4 out of 7 commissioners present.
Thank you very much. Pulling the agenda up. So next on the agenda is commissioner comments. Do any commissioners have any comments they wish to share? I've got just one, just a note of interest. As it is election season, there's a lot of information going around right now, but I just wanted to note that on the weekly rig reports that we get, that Colorado currently has 17 active rigs. Utah has 8, Wyoming has 14, Kansas has 7. I know there's a lot of information going around there about activity of oil and gas in Colorado versus some other states. And so I thought it was important just to share some of that information on the weekly rig report status. With that, if there's no other commissioner comments, I think next up is public comment, general public comment. It is possible that we have one person for general public comment. Ms. Larson, is Karen Hawkins in the room, realizing that we have public comment that'll be associated with upcoming OGDPs specific to those, but there is the opportunity, should Karen be interested in just general public comment, to share that now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do not see Ms. Hawkins in the meeting at the moment, so I'm assuming then she did only wish to speak specifically on one of the OGDPs.
Okay, great. So with that, next on our agenda is the consent agenda. Does anyone have questions about the consent agenda? Seeing no questions, I would entertain a motion.
Motion to approve the consent agenda, June 8th.
Second.
We've got a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? That motion carries. Next up on our agenda is a presentation by Dr. Ryan Edwards from Oxycarbon Ventures on innovations in the oil and gas industry, carbon sequestration. So with that, if we want to bring Dr. Edwards into the panel, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you see me and hear me?
We can see you and hear you.
Great. Well, it's an honor to be invited here, and very glad to be able to talk about what Oxy is doing on around carbon management and our goals to get to net zero emissions. So I'll try and get my presentation up here. Okay, do you see this and it's filling up the whole screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, so before I start, my name's Ryan Edwards. I am the manager of climate policy in Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, which is the subsidiary of Oxy that's leading our low carbon work. My background is I did my PhD in CO2 sequestration, storing CO2 back underground, as well as some policy analysis type work that led on to working in the Senate on the staff of a senator on carbon capture and climate policy. And now I've been at Oxy about 3 years in my position, where mostly I work on policy, a lot of federal policy work, but my background is technical, so I can kind of speak to both sides of that here. And so what I'm going to talk about is Oxy's goals on reaching net zero emissions, which are very ambitious, and then on how we're achieving that through carbon management and what those technologies are, and the opportunities, including some in Colorado. Any questions up front about framing or who I am or what we're doing?
Commissioners, does anyone have questions at this point?
None for me, Chair.
And also, I'd just say that, as we go through, a lot of this might be new. Feel free to jump in with questions at any time. I always feel it's better to make sure we're all on the same page as we go along rather than lose anyone.
That sounds good.
Okay, the usual statements that I really don't know what they say, but apparently they're important. Okay, so just some background on Oxy. I assume you may be familiar with Oxy in general, but Oxy is a large oil and gas and chemicals company. We do have international presence, as this map shows. Core operations are in the United States, though, particularly in the Permian Basin and in Colorado, where we are the largest producer. That's in the oil and gas side. Oxy also has a large chemicals company, OxyChem, which is a top producer of a number of base chemicals, which actually is really important in how we go about our carbon management goals, because of the industrial facility experience, et cetera, that we get through the chemicals division. So a really important part of the company as well. And so Oxy, I think it's fair to say, is really a leader amongst US oil and gas companies in our ambition on climate and reaching net zero emissions. We announced, I think back in 2020 now, an ambition to achieve net zero emissions for all of our emissions, including the emissions that we directly produce ourselves, but also the emissions released when our products are used downstream. So when our oil and gas is burnt, we want to be net zero across all those emissions as a company by 2050, which is the goal that generally is put out there as alignment with what we need to achieve the Paris Agreement's objectives. Net zero globally by 2050. Before that, we've got a goal for 2040 for net zero on just our own operational emissions. So that's not also taking consideration of the products, with ambition to achieve that even sooner. We think we can. And also, even before that, in the near term, we have, I think there's 17 different climate targets we have, ranging from this year, near term, out to the 2050 goal across different timeframes. There's also shorter term targets, which are more focused on reducing our direct emissions. This is really quite a significant target by 2024 to reduce our emissions by what is the equivalent of about 13%, which is a significant reduction in only 2 years. And by 2032, there's a medium goal on how much we'll start scaling up our carbon management and geologic storage operations. I'm going to go further into what that is, what carbon management is, what are the different parts of it in a minute. But just to lay out kind of the ambition of what we're doing here. As it says in the arrow there, carbon capture, utilization and storage technologies and direct air capture technologies are really key to how we're going to achieve that. And we will explain what all of that is. So how are we going to get there? We've done a lot of work on a comprehensive strategy for achieving net zero. And there are different buckets. I mentioned some of it just before. There's a huge focus on carbon management, on technologies that capture CO2 from either industrial sources or out of the air, permanently store that CO2 back in reservoirs deep underground. Also, we have to directly reduce our emissions as much as possible. A lot of activity going on there, a big focus on methane, and some of the things that we've learned in Colorado, through Colorado's efforts on methane, are things that we're really being able to take to the whole company now in reducing methane emissions. And direct air capture, as we have there in removal, is really a big focus, and I'll talk about what we're doing on that. So overall, it is reduce our emissions as much as possible, then capture CO2 for other companies, capture some of our own CO2 emissions, and also build at large scale facilities to remove CO2 from the air. Doing all those things together, we can be net zero as a company. Okay, so what is carbon management and how does it fit into getting the economy to net zero where it needs to get? So there's a few parts. Overall, I would call this carbon management. Basically, carbon is crucial to energy systems, to life. There will always be big flows of carbon going through our economy and through the globe. But what we need to do is be able to manage that in a way that means we're not putting net emissions into the air, because that's what causes climate change. And so that's what we want to be the leader in how do we manage CO2. So there's some different parts of this. So traditional, you may have heard of CCS, carbon capture. That's usually referring to what we call industrial capture of CO2 from large point source emitters. These are things like power plants, coal and natural gas power plants, industrial facilities of all kinds, refineries, fertilizer production, ethanol, cement, you name it. Many large industrial facilities that have significant CO2 emissions. Many of those emissions are amenable to be captured through carbon capture technologies that scrub the flue gas from those facilities and remove the CO2. Once you've done that, you can sequester the CO2 deep underground, or an increasing option is utilization. I'll talk about that. Another part of carbon management is direct air capture. So there are some emissions we can capture from point sources, where it's going to be easiest and cheapest to do that. But there are other emissions all throughout the economy that are just going to be very difficult and very expensive to avoid. As well as that, all of the science shows us that there's already too much CO2 in the atmosphere, and there's going to be more. And so we have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere to get to where we need to get from climate. And so that's where direct air capture comes in. That's directly removing CO2 from the ambient air, and then again, either sequestering that permanently or converting that into products. A great nexus with Oxy, and this is really the starting point of our journey on carbon management, and I'll talk about that a bit more coming up, is by removing CO2 from the air and using that in our existing oil operations for enhanced oil recovery. This is something Oxy's done for 50 years now. We can produce oil that has net zero emissions. That's really a huge opportunity, because we know that to get the transportation sector to net zero emissions, liquid fuels that have net zero emissions are a critical thing that the world needs. And that's something we can do through our existing EOR operations plus direct air capture. And so if we look at kind of in the industrial economy and how this all fits together and what we see as like a carbon management system, as I said, we have point source capture coming from industrial facilities, from power plants, and we have direct air capture, capturing CO2 from the air. All of that needs to be powered to make it net zero. It needs to be powered by emissions-free power, wind and solar, nuclear, gas and coal with carbon capture. All these we see as great options for powering our facilities, and we're pursuing all options. Once we have captured CO2, whether it's from point sources or the air, we can then permanently sequester that in dedicated CO2 sequestration, where it goes more than a mile underground into reservoirs that trap that CO2 just the same way, with exactly the same mechanisms that oil and gas has been trapped in the subsurface for millions of years. So we know it's very secure. Or an increasing option is technologies that convert that CO2 into useful products. Oxy is invested in multiple CO2 utilization technologies. One example is a company called Semvita. They have bioengineered bacteria, cyanobacteria, to basically eat CO2 and produce ethylene. And ethylene is the basic building block of many plastics and other materials that we use. And so we see that as really exciting technology, and it's just one of a number of technologies emerging for options to do something productive with CO2 that's been captured. Another option, as I mentioned, is to sequester CO2 through enhanced oil recovery operations, where that CO2 would go into oil reservoirs. And through that, we can produce net zero fuels that can then be used in transportation. We can capture CO2 from transportation. And what we see here is kind of an economy where there's a closed loop for CO2, as well as capture from other sources that would otherwise emit it. And so in net, we can have many of the same infrastructure, many of the same transportation options, equipment, exactly the same planes, but make this a net zero system. Obviously, we need everything: wind, solar. It's very clear in all the analysis of how we get to where we need to go on climate that we need everything. But the carbon management, carbon capture, direct air capture is a key part. Again, comes up in all these analyses that it's going to play a key role in getting us to net zero. Okay, so just digging into some of those elements, I'll just play a little video here. Hopefully it works. These things are always prone for failure. But this is just going to step through a little bit of what CO2 sequestration is. Now, CO2 sequestration is something that has actually been done for 50 years through Oxy's operations. We've injected CO2 and it's been permanently trapped in reservoirs. It's been done as a standalone activity for over 25 years. Elsewhere in the world. So it is very well proven, but it is a new concept to a lot of people. And the idea of putting CO2 underground into reservoirs. So this video will just go through a little bit of the basics.
Capturing emissions is critical to restoring balance to our atmosphere. CO2 go after it's captured? The answer is geologic sequestration, a safe and permanent way to store captured carbon deep underground. It begins by condensing CO2 from gas into liquid, removing any water or corrosive elements, so only CO2 gets ejected. The injection well is engineered with multiple layers of steel and cement casing to ensure absolutely no leaks on the way down. It reaches deep underground to a safe depth, where the CO2 is deposited into a storage reservoir. The reservoir is not some big underground cavern. It's actually a solid rock with millions of pore spaces, each one smaller than a single strand of human hair. The injected CO2 can be trapped in the porous rock by 3 different methods: residual trapping, where the liquid CO2 settles between the pore spaces; solution trapping, where it dissolves into other fluids already trapped in the reservoir; and mineral trapping, where CO2 molecules interact with existing minerals and bind to the rock. But how does the CO2 stay underground? A non-porous, impermeable cap rock makes it impossible for CO2 to seep upwards. This cap rock extends for hundreds of meters, permanently sequestering the CO2 below. Our monitoring systems, fail-safe redundancy, and 24-hour surveillance ensure a safe operation for the environment and the community. Conservative estimates show that the U.S. has 8.3 trillion metric tons of storage capacity. That's enough to store the annual emissions of 35 billion vehicles for the next 50 years. And that's how we can leverage geologic sequestration to help restore the balance.
Okay, so the summary there, which you may have noticed, is it really looks a lot like oil and gas production, but in reverse, putting the fluid back in the reservoir instead of taking it out of the reservoir. And there is huge technical potential to store CO2. The United States is blessed with some of the best geology in the world for this. and including Colorado, definitely has some potentially great geology for CO2 storage. Next slide. Okay. And so Oxy Low Carbon Ventures is, as I mentioned at the start, I work for Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, a subsidiary of Oxy that is working on getting us to this carbon management vision. And we're doing a few things. One is investing in technologies in carbon management, including direct air capture, point source capture. I'll talk about some of those technologies coming up, utilization, and helping bring those technologies forward. We're also developing projects, so implementing CCUS projects, developing sequestration hubs. Again, I'll go into more detail on this. And finally, we're helping other companies and organizations to implement their projects through the experience that Oxy has, helping to implement CO2 management projects. Along with, as I mentioned, other initiatives in reducing emissions directly, which are kind of the bread and butter. We all have to be doing those things, and then the carbon management stuff on top of that. And so I could have said this earlier, but this is a key part of the story, is why are we doing this? Why is Oxy going headfirst into carbon management? Why is that our future? Part of that is because it is our past. So for 50 years, Oxy's been capturing, transporting, and sequestering CO2 at large scale. We today sequester 20 million tons of CO2 a year, which is equivalent of the emissions from about 5 million cars. It's quite a lot of CO2 that we sequester every year. And that's been through our CO2 enhanced oil recovery operations, where traditionally it was this is a way to produce more oil. It's a depleted oil reservoirs where very little oil can be recovered anymore. If you inject CO2, it acts as basically a solvent and helps dissolve and move more of the oil that otherwise couldn't be recovered. And you can increase recovery up to 20-25% by CO2 enhanced oil recovery. And so Oxy's been the largest, the company with the largest CO2 EOR operations in the world. Currently is the largest operations in the world. Most of that's in Permian Basin of West Texas. And so we have just very strong DNA in how to handle CO2, how to store CO2. And so now come along climate as a concern and carbon capture and carbon sequestration as a key thing that the world needs to do to achieve its climate goals. It's just a very natural fit for Oxy, and that's really why we're spearheading this. I see it as a huge opportunity for our future. Okay, and so in particular, probably the biggest single focus of our activity right now is direct air capture, removing CO2 directly from the air and sequestering it deep underground. We have a development company called 1.5, which is currently working on deploying the first large-scale direct air capture facility in the world. Today, there are 3 direct air capture companies that have deployed pilot projects. The largest of these removes 4,000 tons of CO2 from the air every year. For context, that's very small compared to the millions of tons I've been talking about so far. But this first large-scale facility we're working on will be up to 1 million tons per year. So just a huge scale up on what's been done before, and starting to get at the scale that we need these facilities to be for meaningful climate scale removal of CO2. So we're partnering with a company called Carbon Engineering, which has developed this particular direct air capture technology. And what makes it so exciting to Oxy and why we think we can scale this so quickly is, first of all the core unit operations of this technology actually exist already in other industries. And so we're just basically packaging them, rearranging them in a different process configuration. Also, one of the main materials needed in the plant and the actual capture solvent used by the plant are things that Oxy Chemo, some of the largest producers from. And so we're a large producer. We understand the chemistry. We understand how this works very deeply. Gives us a lot of comfort and knowledge that we can scale this technology. So that's currently under front-end engineering design. We're partnering with Worley, the large global engineering firm. Currently under engineering design, we'll commence construction by the end of this year for the first facility in the Permian Basin. And this is really the first demonstration at large scale of this technology. And from there, we envision deploying these as fast as we can right across the world. I don't think I have a slide on it, but it's been in the news just yesterday, kind of our development plan that we've released to try and build 70 of these at least by 2035. So it's a very aggressive, ambitious schedule on which we want to start deploying these large facilities. Just a few numbers here. These are significant large facilities, each standard 1 million ton per year. This is an artist rendering of the Permian facility. It's shown here. These big long banks are the air contactors where air gets pulled in and contacted with the solvent that binds the CO2. These are large industrial facilities, thousands of jobs in construction, hundreds of permanent jobs for each facility. So in addition to our direct air capture development, another focus is the development of CO2 storage hubs. As I mentioned, Oxy has 50 years of experience in storing CO2 deep underground. And so what we want to do is develop hubs where we build CO2 sequestration capacity in wells, and then we can take CO2 from different industrial emitters that want to capture their CO2, and basically we deal with the CO2 for them. It gets captured, we'll transport it and store it and make sure that CO2 is permanently stored. We're looking at these in a number of locations across the country. A few of the dark colored states are some of the more advanced, where some of the more advanced hubs are, and some of the dots are some specific projects. You'll see one there in Colorado, which I'll talk about a bit later. Okay, and so one of the things I mentioned that is exciting and something that we see as having an important role in climate mitigation in the transport sector, especially, is the ability that we have to produce net zero oil. And so, as I mentioned, we've been doing EOR, enhanced oil recovery with CO2 for 50 years now, in which CO2 is injected and permanently stored in oil reservoirs and oil is produced. And so what we can do with net zero oil is basically remove as much CO2 from the air and sequester it in a reservoir as the emissions will be from the life cycle of that oil, which means the balance is zero. From that whole operation of sequestering and producing oil, zero emissions net balance. This diagram here just shows how that works. Basically, we remove CO2 from the atmosphere using direct air capture. That has to be powered by zero emissions power. That's really important. Otherwise, you'll have other net emissions in the process. Once we've removed that CO2 from the air, inject it into one of our enhanced oil recovery reservoirs where that CO2 will be permanently stored. Oil will be produced, which will then go down into the existing supply chain of oil and gas, of oil to produce fuels. So it'll be refined and become a fuel that will then be burnt, and that CO2 will be released back in the atmosphere at the point that it's actually combusted and used as a fuel. But we can make sure that that whole cycle has net zero emissions. And so this is where we can use existing infrastructure, existing transport fleets, but have net zero emissions. So we see a really, really big opportunity to do this. Very scalable and very exciting. I think this is my last slide. No, I've got a couple more. So finally, I just want to focus in a little bit more on Colorado and some of the opportunities in Colorado that we're involved in. I know there are other carbon management projects that are being pursued in Colorado, but these are the ones that Oxy is involved in. So one here is the Wholesome cement plant in Florence, Colorado. A lot of the analyses on how we get to net zero, time and time again, cement comes up as something that will be really hard to decarbonize without carbon capture. The production of CO2 is inherent to the chemistry of making cement, because you take calcium carbonate, limestone, and you decompose it into calcium oxide and CO2. It's literally part of the chemistry. You have to produce that CO2. And so capturing that CO2 is really the main option for decarbonizing or reducing emissions from cement. And so we're part of a pre-feed study, past feasibility pre-feed study on that plant in Florence, Colorado, that would be capturing CO2 from that facility. We're partnering with a technology provider that is looking at using their technology on the facility with Wholesome, and our role is looking at how to take the CO2 and sequester it. What are the options for that? Where could we do that? And so this is still relatively early stage, but it is the leading cement capture project in America. It's the furthest along. It's kind of the flagship. And so this will be a really a good project to watch, and we really hope this can move along in the coming years. Finally is net power. So net power is one of the technologies we've invested in. What net power is a new natural gas fired electricity generation technology, which basically it's a new power production cycle that actually uses CO2 itself as the working fluid in the turbine. Cool details to go into, but basically what it means is that the CO2 is inherently captured in the cycle. There is no inherent emission to the atmosphere. Inherently, as part of the way the power is produced in this cycle, the CO2 is captured with no additional equipment that needs to be added afterwards, no additional cost that needs to be added afterwards. The CO2 is inherently captured. It's also very flexible. It's a technology that can potentially ramp up and down to match and play well with wind and solar as they increase in the grid. And so we literally, call this and see this as the power plant of the future. We're partnering with Net Power. We're an investor in Net Power. We're also partnering on helping to deploy the initial projects. There's been several potential initial commercial projects announced, and one of those is in Colorado. I don't know, I may pronounce it wrong, but the Southern Ute tribe or reservation down in the southwest of Colorado is working with Net Power on a potential project there, which you may be aware of, but there's information out there about that. So exciting new technology and potential, hopefully, that will get deployed in Colorado as one of the very first projects. So that's it. I'll leave it there, and I hope there's some questions. I hope I didn't bore you to death.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for that presentation. Super interesting. I imagine commissioners have questions. Commissioner Bogue.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. That was great. A quick question sort of about scale of implementation. I think you mentioned that the current plans for Oxy Low Carbon Ventures are to deploy about 70 of these DAC facilities, I think globally. So let's say 70 million metric tons. Just thinking about scale, that's about half of the net annual emissions for the state of Colorado. So if we're thinking globally, I'm just sort of thinking about the impact that these projects can have in total. And so I'm curious just to hear about your competitors, if you're willing to share any perspective on that, the extent to which you feel like Oxy Low Carbon Ventures is really leading in this space and has the most ambitious plans, or if there are others out there who are thinking about scaling at a similar pace.
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly, yeah, to state the obvious, 70 million tons is a huge scale up and very ambitious, but it's also a drop in the bucket of what's needed. As you pointed out, with it being about half of just Colorado's emissions. Point out that's just by 2035. So that's just in the next, basically the first one will come online the end of 2024. So it's really a 10-year program there to deploy 70. That looks like an exponential curve. What will come after that is more and more, faster and faster. That's the plan. But 70 is kind of the medium goal there. there's also there's currently policy enhancements under discussion in Congress in the United States, but also many countries around the world. And there's kind of that's a base case of 70. We do see if some of those policies come through that we can accelerate more. So in terms of direct air capture, I'll say there is Oxy and our plans are by far the most largest scale, the most ambitious. The other leading company is Climeworks, a European company. They are who deployed the 4,000 ton facility. That's the largest one operating today. They have laid out a plan that they want to get to their first 1 million ton plant by 2030. So it's certainly slower than what we're imagining here, but I also would guess that some of the same benefit of additional incentives and demand coming on around the world could accelerate that for them as well. And finally, I'll say that there is a kind of, I would say, two-track or bifurcated landscape in direct air capture right now, and carbon removal in general. Direct air capture is one technology of other ways you could remove carbon from the atmosphere. There are things like ocean mineralization. There's other things that can remove CO2 in direct. So there's kind of Climeworks, the European company, and Carbon Engineering, the Canadian company we're partnering with. They actually started 10 years ago. They were really, at the time, people almost laughed at them. Like, what are you doing? Well, what's this direct air capture stuff? But they're 10 years ahead on, like, they've got to a point where we can start deploying their technologies. Just in the last couple years, there's an absolute flood of new ideas, new startups, new technologies in carbon removal and direct air capture. Definitely every week, almost every day, I'm reading an article about a new, different type of technology proposed. And so there is a lot coming, but these ones are kind of 10 years behind where Carbon Engineering is, right? They're just starting now. And these are certainly, for any new technology, it's a long and arduous journey to get from your idea to being able to deploy at scale. So I'd say the cavalry's coming, but Carbon Engineering and Oxy are definitely at the very leading edge of scalability right now.
Thank you.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and thanks, Dr. Edwards, for the presentation. Really appreciate you being here and giving us all this information. So you talked about kind of two different ways that carbon's captured from the atmosphere, from source emitters and from the direct air capture. And I'm curious, when I look at the renderings for the projects that are, the DACs, the direct air capture, they're huge in scale, or so it appears, from the presentation. And I'm curious, what's the, how much does that vary when you start thinking about the whole suite of carbon capture and what that looks like, from something that would be direct on a source to something all the way that's meant to capture out of the atmosphere? And one of the things that we wrestle with here on this commission is understanding the interaction of some of these, oil and gas industrial operations and other uses and other existence, including, residential existence here in the state. And so I'm just curious, can you tell me more about the size, the scale, the impacts of kind of the variety that these projects may take on?
Yeah, that's another great question. So I'll differentiate three different things. First of all is the point source capture. That's capturing from a industrial facility. These don't take much land at all, right? It's basically the addition that will be needed, the additional bit of equipment that gets bolted on to that existing facility, typically will fit in the existing footprint of that industrial facility. It's just another unit operation within an existing facility. Sometimes, if there's not room on that facility, they may park it next door, but it will be a small additional expansion. So you can think of that in terms of the existing industrial park kind of scales, and not really expanding the size of those existing industrial facilities. Direct air capture, that is a new facility you have to go build, and as you saw from the rendering, that is they are not insignificant facilities. Off the top of my head, I think it's something like 100 acres for a 1 million ton plant. So it's not. It again is on the scale of large chemicals facilities that exist today. but we need to build a lot of these for the climate. So not insignificant, but within the scale of other industrial facilities that exist out there for a direct air capture facility. But then there's kind of another interesting conversation is the different ways to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. As I mentioned, carbon removal is the broad term, ways to get CO2 back out of the atmosphere. Direct air capture is one technology amongst some of the other main examples are kind of bioenergy with capture and storage. So where you grow a crop or harvest trees and then burn those, capture the CO2 and sequester it. So you effectively use the tree as a pump to pull the CO2 out of the air. Ocean technologies, which there are different types, can be involving growing kelp or spreading certain minerals in the ocean to make it take up CO2, mineralizing existing minerals that exist in the Earth's crust to make them draw down CO2. There's a whole family of potential carbon removal technologies. And when you look at those, a lot of them do need a lot of land, that you start talking about very, very large land areas. And on the scale of those, direct air capture is the most land efficient way to do it because it's an intensified mechanical, chemical, industrial process, right? You're using that at an intense scale versus some of the other ones are enhancing or using natural systems at a much bigger scale. And so certainly as we look to what do we need to do to remove CO2, land use is going to be an absolutely key consideration in how we can actually scale what we need to do to get CO2 out of the air. And amongst that conversation, direct air capture clearly stands out as the one that needs the least land.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for that answer. Yeah, I was thinking about that a little bit, and I was also thinking about kind of where the carbon's captured and where the carbon is disposed of or stored, may not always be in the same spot. And kind of, we looked at that diagram, kind of you're pumping it from the air, you're dropping it through your separators or whatever they're called. I'm not using the right words here. And then they're going down a cased wellbore into formation, and then kind of covered over by the cap rock. And I'm curious, how often do the opportunities exist for you to have capture and storage in the same spot? And when you don't have that, what kind of infrastructure is needed and what does that look like? Are you talking about, a field of well bores, with pipeline going in there? Are you talking about a single one? How does that all work?
Another great question. Yeah. So let's start with, so for direct air capture, you have more flexibility that you can locate the facility near where you have good storage. That's always going to be the easiest thing. Some of the places we're looking at doing it, actually all of the initial places we're looking at deploying our large direct air capture, it will be right on top of the storage. And so the storage wells will just be in the same footprint as the direct air capture facility. That won't always be true, especially as we have to scale larger and larger. The places you can site the facility compared to where you have the good geology for the sequestration won't always match up. And when you look at point sources, that's even more likely to be true because those point sources exist already. We didn't plan out back when these were built that was also a good place for CO2 storage geology. There are some places in the United States where that does exist, but not that many. And so often there will be a need for pipelines. Pipelines is the main way to transport CO2. The US has about 5,000 miles of existing CO2 pipelines, has an existing regulatory framework for that because they've been around for nearly 50 years. As long as we've been doing CO2 enhanced oil recovery, we've had to move CO2 by pipeline. They have a very strong safety record. There's never been any fatality associated with CO2 pipelines. They can't combust, so that's an advantage that CO2 pipelines have. But for sure, just to scale up, there will need to be an expansion. Some numbers that might help you kind of grasp the scale. Today in the United States, there's, depending on how you want to count gathering lines versus main pipelines, but of like serious main oil and gas pipelines, there's like 2 million miles, 2 to 3 million miles of oil and gas pipelines in America. The analyses, amongst the analyses that have been done looking at, okay, to deploy carbon management at the scale that's going to be needed, how much pipeline would be needed. There's been a couple really good studies done on that. They come out with numbers around the 50,000 to 100,000 miles. So 50,000 or 100,000 miles compared with millions of miles, much smaller amount of pipeline, much smaller footprint that will be needed for CO2 pipelines, but there will be pipelines needed for sure. And finally, the final part was, what does kind of the CO2 sequestration site look like? And so for that, much fewer wells than for oil and gas production. So to sequester in a good location, we can sequester about 1 million tons of CO2 per year through one single well. And a large scale sequestration hub would be about 5 million tons per year. So you talk about 5 wells. 5 million tons is the emissions from a large coal-fired power plant. Or when you look at industrial facilities, they're typically smaller. And so you might often get 500,000 tons or 1 million tons per year from one industrial facility, things like the cement plants, like refineries, etc. So at one sequestration site, you can take the emissions from 10 industrial facilities. So yeah, versus oil and gas, where you often have many more wells in a well field. Only talking about 1 or 2 or a handful of wells with CO2 sequestration.
Yeah, that's super helpful because, we think about this, or you kind of mentioned it's oil and gas in reverse almost, right, with the way the process works. And so I was trying to understand, hey, does this look the same as having an oil field, or, is it more consolidated? It sounds like it's a lot more consolidated and there's a lot more opportunity for volume per well, I guess, for the benefit that Capture's trying to accomplish. And
could go into I mean, this is what my PhD was in. I can go to as much detail as you like, but basically, you can, how to reconcile that is basically that, oil and gas. First of all, you can only find like the last, as it was generated and migrated up in the subsurface over time. We're trying to find these little pockets where a bit of it got stuck over geologic time, right? Whereas CO2 sequestration, we don't care about. We just want to inject into the whole reservoir, and so you've just got more space that you can access from one well versus having to have a lot of wells to try and get at the different little pockets you got to try and find in oil and gas.
So would you say it's more analogous to kind of shale injection, where it's in a tighter rock versus, in I guess into some sort of like geologic trap is kind of the way we think about traditional oil and gas storage. Is that kind of more analogous there?
I think it's closer to the traditional conventional. You've got a cap structure, which there can be different forms of that. It doesn't necessarily have to be a single dome. You can have expansive, fairly flat. As long as there's a seal, you're good. So it's more like a very high productive conventional well in reverse. That's, I think, the easiest way to think about it.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you very much.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Edwards, for this discussion today. It's super interesting. Along this same kind of discussion and lines, is every well that is at the end of its useful life potentially a carbon sequestration site?
Not every well. You need a certain depth for where CO2 is. Basically, it has to be deep enough in the subsurface that CO2 will be in its dense form. You don't want to be a gas, you want to be in its liquid-like form, as that video said. That's about 1 mile deep. So, I mean, I think most oil and gas wells will be that deep, but you need certain, you want more permeable reservoirs. There's a cap rock from oil and gas, which is a good thing. And so that's why oil and gas reservoirs are often very good contenders, because there's a seal that's been competent over millions of years. But not all reservoirs. There'll be some subset. I can't really quantify that for you in real time of what percentage that would be, but there's always layers of screening of to what the most suitable places are.
Oh, I understand that. Thanks. That's helpful.
I'd also just say that we are always working on expanding that family. Traditionally, Oxy's enhanced oil recovery operations have been done in conventional reservoirs, but we've been working for several years now on CO2 enhanced oil recovery and unconventionals, and there's been some really promising work on that. So that's definitely a future frontier.
And I've been, you talked a little bit about carrying capacity. I'll call it carrying capacity, like how much carbon can be sequestered and stored and for how long. And I think it was, did you say 8.3 trillion tons?
Yeah, I think that was.
And was that total or every year? I'm sorry, that was just kind of a quick.
That'd be a total number. Yeah.
And so I know that you said that was some sort of, you compared it to miles of vehicle travel.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to quantify what that really means. And so I guess for me, this is a tool, but it's not the end all be all. It can't capture enough. This is just one tool for us to look at as we look to the future and how we're gonna reduce our footprint.
Yeah. Oh, it's definitely one tool in the toolbox. When you look at how we need to get to where we need to get to, there's a whole range of things we need, from renewables, hydrogen, electrification, et cetera. Carbon sequestration is one key part there. Yeah, those numbers, I didn't make that video. I would, a way that makes more sense to me is basically the world currently emits about 50 billion tons a year of CO2. There are the amount of CO2 sequestration capacity globally, and it scales to the United States either way, is enough for hundreds of years worth of total global current emissions. Scale that back to the United States. The United States has enough CO2 geology amenable to CO2 storage for hundreds of years of the United States total current emissions. But then think about the fact that no one's saying there's going to be a world where we store every emission and capture and store it. Most analyses, it's more like 1/5, maybe 1/5 of what we're currently capturing or currently emitting would be what would need to be captured. And so do the math there again. We're not going to run out of CO2 storage geology space anytime soon.
Thank you. I really appreciated the presentation today.
My pleasure.
I've got a couple questions, and I really appreciate the presentation, Dr. Edwards. This is super interesting, and I am not a scientist, so I'm going to ask some stupid questions.
They were good questions.
So, I often hear about CO2 storage and the cap rock and the different geologic layers that you need in order to be able to capture it. And I keep thinking in my layperson's brain, things that are stored underground find their way to the surface. And so how do we ensure that this stays sequestered and not, induce seismicity or find fissures or just, over time find its way to the surface and negate these efforts?
Yep. That's a critical and great question. Definitely nothing we ever undertake is without risk. And, we have to mitigate those risks and have to acknowledge that and do them, make sure that they're mitigated to the extent possible. Having said that, there's been a vast amount of academic work done on CO2 storage and evaluating the risks. There is a very long history in operation. As I said, 50 years of Oxy doing it for enhanced oil recovery, over 25 years for just dedicated storage. And all the data and all the studies do show that the risk is extremely small. Just because of the physics of the subsurface, basically, that as long as there's a competent cap rock, the physics are such that it's hard to get CO2 back out. It basically gets stuck in the little pores, trapped by capillary forces. It's very hard to get it back out. It's literally what some of my modeling work was in my PhD. So we know the risks are small, especially when you're injecting, you've got a driving force. You know, you're pumping that in, but then over time, the pressure, when you stop injecting, the pressure dissipates and there's much less driving force to try and to push that CO2 out. And so the risk is always getting lower and lower and lower in time into the future, which is a good characteristic. But right back to the start of, while the risks are small, there are risks. You could do it wrong and there could be leaks. And so what we need to prevent that is a very strong regulatory framework and industry safety standards, which exists. So the Class 6 program under the EPA, Class 6 wells under the Underground Injection Control Program was established over 10 years ago, is very comprehensive. And a key part of that, back to I think the key part of how I would answer that question, you need to, before you go and inject CO2, do rigorous characterization to prove that that's a good place to put CO2. As long as if you've got a competent cap rock, a lack of faults around, you understand the seismicity behavior of that site and where the limits are, then you can manage it very well within those bounds. But you got to know that, and you got to prove that you know that before you go and do this. And that's what the Class 6 program's in place to do. Well integrity obviously is critical. There's very rigorous well standards in place under the Class 6 wells. And so as long as you do it in a good site and you have a good framework in place to make sure that happens, the rest of the science and the history tells us as long as that is true, the risk is exceedingly small. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that is. I appreciate that explanation. And so again, this is, I mean, I guess from the direct CO2 capture concept with the facilities, I mean, I in my brain, I can only think of it as a giant dehumidifier, even though I understand it's not. But I'm trying to understand what are the potential local impacts to like kind of the localized impacts to having that CO2 sequestered as CO2 is necessary for agriculture and other things. I mean, is there localized impacts or anticipated localized impacts to having that big a facility?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So I'll separate point source capture and direct air capture. Let's talk about direct air capture first. Direct air capture, all that facility is doing is sucking in air, passing it over a solvent or through a filter. There's different types of technologies. And then the exhaust is just air that's depleted in CO2. The actual emissions from that facility are basically non-existent. There's a chance of some solvent getting entrained in the air and going out in the exhaust. So that's something we are studying closely and making sure that isn't a significant issue. The solvent isn't particularly harmful, which is good. But besides that, it's depleted CO2 air, and we do get the question often, like, is the air so depleted in CO2 that it will harm plants, or people will have it will harm plants that need the CO2? The answer to that is basically no. Like the atmosphere is well enough mixed that very quickly is dissipated and isn't going to be like a plume of super depleted CO2 air. And also even the CO2 that is in the exhaust is not that depleted. There's still CO2 in that air. It's not zero. So yeah, a lot of work's been done on, because obviously this really matters for the direct air capture facility, because direct air capture facility needs to know that it's not going to self-deplete the air around it. Because if it's sucking in air that has no CO2 in it, it's not removing any CO2. We need to know that it's always going to be high concentration CO2 in the air that comes in, highest possible. So lots of fluid dynamics modeling, et cetera, has been done on this, and consistently shows that it's not a concern, that the air is well enough mixed that gets replenished very quickly. Point source capture, that's a different category where now it's not sucking something out of the air. Now you've got what was a emitting facility that's emitting a plume of CO2. Often there are other pollutants in those plumes, SOx, NOx, PM, all those things. This will be a very site by site specific case, because every facility is different. The local atmospheric conditions are different. So I don't want to make blanket statements other than to say that most carbon capture technologies, and the leading ones that are by far the most likely to be used for sure are in this category. They also remove almost all the NOx and PM from the flue stream. And so by having to apply carbon capture, most of the time, it's likely that you're also going to reduce air pollutants and local pollutants. So there often should be a co-benefit there for air quality of the carbon capture. Again, can't make a blanket statement because every case is unique. You need to do the site-specific analysis, but in general, you are removing other pollutants as well as the CO2 in carbon capture technologies. There will be some additional water needs for point source carbon capture or direct air, depending on the technology. There's different technologies, so that it's going to vary a lot also by technology. But energy and water, just additional inputs that are already needed for the facility. You have some additional inputs. Those are typically modest increases on what the facility already uses. And so I think that's kind of the main local ways there can be local impacts.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for answering my questions. Do commissioners have further questions? Commissioner Bogue?
Thanks. I just have one add-on to Commissioner Messner's questions, and apologies if you already mentioned this, but how loud are the fans on a DAC facility?
That is a good question. I don't know the answer. These are industrial size facilities and fans, so I would imagine there's some noise. I haven't heard of it. We're working on the permitting and implementation of building this first large facility. I haven't heard of it coming up as a significant issue at all. But I got to go ask the team about that. I can get back to you. It's going to be less than an airport or something for sure. But yeah, it'll be something. I don't know how far that will go.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? Well, Dr. Edwards, appreciate you coming and sharing to us today. Super interesting information, and looking forward to hearing more about it.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. And any follow-up questions, I don't know if it has been shared already, but I can get you all my email address, and always happy to help if there are any questions.
Yeah, Dr. Edwards, if it's all right, I can share with the commissioners your email address, and that way we can reach out independently if we need to speak a little further.
I think the presentation will be shared as well.
Sounds good.
Thanks, guys.
Great. Thank you very much. Commissioner Gonzalez, did you have something? Or are you just waving goodbye?
Just waving goodbye.
All right. 10:05. I think now is a good time to take a break. So maybe we'll come back 10:20. Good morning, commissioners. I was informed that Chairman Robbins is going to be able to attend starting at 10:40. And seeing as we are ahead of schedule, and it would be good to have full participation in the next few items, I would suggest that we take a further break until 10:40 to allow Chairman Robbins to join us. Everyone okay with that? Okay, so we'll see everyone at 10:40.
Commissioners, I am now in attendance. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, welcome. Sorry, folks. I had an inability to attend the first part of the session, but I'm here for the rest of the day. Jeff Robbins, Chair of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. We have a quorum, and we will now move on to our next docket. And hearings manager Larson, I believe we have 2 public commenters followed by Mr. Maxey and then a presentation from the applicant. Is that accurate?
That is correct, Mr. Chair.
I see we have Kate Christensen, and I believe we had Carol Hawkins as well. Is she in the meeting?
Ms. Hawkins is, oh yes, Ms. Christensen. I lost her picture. She is here as well.
You hear
All
me?
right, Ms. Hawkins, you get to go first. Go ahead. We can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know why my video's not working, but that's okay. It'll make me more relaxed. My name is Carol Hawkins. I'm a citizen of Alt, Colorado. I moved to Alt, Colorado in late 2017 after the death of my partner. I had been living in Maine for 25 years, but my family migrated to Colorado back in the 1970s. My youngest child was born in Colorado. I did my master's work in Colorado, and I went east for a PhD in English. And I taught literacy for 20 years, particularly writing. I came back to Colorado, having bought a house in Alt sight unseen because I was too busy handling my partner's estate to really come and see the property firsthand. The house is adorable, an arts and crafts bungalow out in the plains. But when I moved here and saw the surrounding community and what has happened to Colorado since the 1990s, I was horrified, re-traumatized, for which I'm still under treatment today. I received a forced pooling notice shortly after I moved here from TDC Energy. Welcome to the community. And even with all my literacy and my writing skills and ability to do research and critical thinking, I could not navigate the COGCC website to form an adequate protest to that forced pooling notice, nor did I even know about fracking, forced pooling. So I was on a very steep learning curve. I reached out to the environmental community, to which I received very warm, caring response. Thankfully, a very generous attorney from Boulder agreed to help me pro bono. English professors don't have deep pockets. So she helped me and I filed that protest, but I was fortunate that PDC withdrew their application. But what I didn't know is they just moved south of town and started horizontal drilling under the town. Recently, jumping to the recent past, just this year, I was coming home from Fort Collins on Route 14. I lived right downtown, right across from the Highland School on Grafe Avenue. And there was a huge drilling rig next to the school on the volunteer fire department lot. I called Jason Maxey. I didn't call him, I emailed him. He took the time to drive by the site, wrote back to me and said he did see the drilling. He did see the storage tanks. I called, before I even called Jason, I called the town manager, who told me she knew nothing. A huge, how many story drilling operation in the center of town, and she knew nothing. She said, oh, they're probably drilling for water. That's not water in those tanks. So I contacted Jason. He took the time, he drove by the site. And he told me there were 2 new sites there. And they had been grandfathered in. Because I said, what about Senate Bill 181? What about the 2,000-foot setbacks? And please refer to my statement. It's a 4-page statement. I have 3 minutes. I have his direct quotes. There's ways around the 2,000-foot setbacks. I'm paraphrasing what he said. And in this case, it's a grandfathered permit. There Since I have moved to Alt, the cornfield behind me has turned into 500 new homes. These 2 new wells in Alt, next to the Highland School, within 500 feet, were permitted because of some grandfathered permit. So we can't just lean on Senate Bill 181. We have to look at other cumulative impacts. Personal narrative, my health. I've been under the care of a pulmonologist for 3 years. I have upper respiratory issues. I have to undergo CT scans once a year. I have nodules on my lungs. I have nosebleeds. My dog wheezes. I just had to go on high blood pressure medication. I'm 70 years old. I wanted to come here and paddleboard up on Horsetooth. I wanted to recover from the loss of my partner, not be re-impacted by the horrors of fracking on the Front Range of Colorado. If you look at the Broomfield study, which I also included in my comments, every comment I make, I cite my source, and I back it up with some research from reputable sources. The Broomfield study, if you live within 1 mile of a fracking site, upper respiratory issues. 2 miles of a fracking site, your children are going to start getting sick. Respiratory issues, intestinal issues, acute responses like nosebleeds. My grandson just moved to this town because he can't afford to buy a new house anywhere else. He's expecting a new baby. I'm scared to death. What are going to be the effects?
Ms. Hawkins, we normally give 3 minutes. You're at 6 now. If you could wrap up, we'd appreciate it. And I would note that the commissioners did receive your written comments as well.
Thank you. I'm sorry to go over. I knew this would be hard for me. Water, I just had my well tested for VOCs. Huge, I have one of the oldest wells in Alt. I was watering my lawn. I went in the house. I came back out to turn off the well. Sulfur, acute smell of sulfur overcame me. I Google it, gas. I contact Jason Maxey. He did tell me to have my well tested. I had it tested for bacteria. It's not E. coli. I'm on a waiting list for a VOC test from the county lab. Over close to 1,000 wells in Weld County have been tested for VOCs, and the results of those tests are not public information. So all I can say is and also please look at the cumulative impact statement that I submitted that was done by some dedicated environmental groups in the state fighting for us. All I can say is government has failed. My local town office, Weld County, and now I'm before the state. Governor Polis's appointed committee. I'm a small d Democrat. I still want to believe in government. You must look at the cumulative impacts. Take my story not about me, but as representative of all those voices that are muted in my community. Think of their health effects. I just happen to be retired and literate enough that I can come before you today with a written statement and having done my research. But I am just representative of a marginalized community that needs equal representation. And the Polis government and this committee must look beyond 2,000-foot setbacks. Government can't fail us. Big oil and gas cannot be too big to fail. Our children and our lives and our environment are in the balance. We can't have another death like Firestone before we see a permit rejected. I beg you, reject the Bayswater permit. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, I would note there is a written document from Ms. Hawkins that you all have reviewed as well. Ms. Christensen, we now will recognize you.
Hi, thanks for taking the time to hear my comments on Bayswater today. They are specific to this OGDP, but they also can be extrapolated to other OGDPs that are being approved. My name is Kate Christensen. I'm the Oil and Gas Campaign Director for 350. I live on the eastern edge of Boulder County, spitting distance from Weld, with my family, my kids. The entire area, as I'm sure you know, has been moved from serious to severe ozone non-attainment by the EPA. I'm sure you're fully aware of the health impacts that our high ozone season that we're coming into right now has on the residents of our state, especially children. I kind of dread this time of year because my kids are going to have to stay inside because of ozone so many of the summer days. And I'm sure you're aware of the fact that oil and gas activity, when you put it all together and not separate it into separate buckets, when you add those buckets together, tanks, point sources, area sources, is 150% of all the small traffic in the state. And please keep that in mind as you consider whether to approve these oil and gas development plans, as it relates specifically to the COGCC's mandate to consider cumulative impacts and protect public health and safety. I'm going to talk about a couple of recent medical studies and recent court cases that relate specifically to the Bayswater OGDP and others that you're considering. There's several that have just come out in the past few months. There's the Broomfield study, which I was going to talk about, but Carol mentioned, so I'll skip that. There was also a study from Alberta, Canada, that showed negative health impacts, especially children born with low birth weight. And as a speech language pathologist, that's something that I really pay attention to because those are kids on my caseload. Those are kids with behavioral problems. Those are kids with low cognitive skills. Those are kids who could have delayed speech and language. The important thing about the Broomfield study is that people were experiencing health impacts a mile away, adults, kids 2 miles away, with the gold standard best management practices, right? Those were the gold standard. The important thing about the Alberta study is that it showed increased negative birth impacts the more unconventional wells that surrounded a family's home. So those are two important things thinking about with cumulative impacts and with the meager 2,000 foot buffer that the commission considers when looking at, and that usually waives when looking at new drilling. There was another study that showed that people living within 2.5 miles of oil and gas wells in California were exposed to levels of air pollutant that linked asthma, cancer, cardiovascular diseases, and preterm birth. So over and over and over again, these studies are showing the same thing. Besides the health research that shows that there needs to be more robust considering of cumulative impacts, there's been some recent court cases that I hope you're aware of that have more to do with the environmental impacts of fracking. Very recently, according to GRIS, the federal court blocked permits for fracking off California coastline. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said that federal agencies failed to take into account the full environmental impacts of hydraulic fracturing, instead relying on an inadequate environmental assessment to issue permits, and those permits were rejected by the federal court. And you're like, I can see, I know what you're thinking, like, that's California. That's California. It just happened in Colorado too. The U.S. District Court blocked a plan approved by federal agencies for 35 fracked wells across 30,000 acres of the U.S. Forest Service between Gunnison and Grand Mesa. The judge wrote that she based on her decision to vacate the drilling plan on the federal agency's own admission that during lawsuit proceedings that they failed some of the required steps of the National Environmental Policy Act process for considering well permits. NEPA has a cumulative impacts definition, which we've submitted to you a few times now. And the judge admitted that these missteps included the analysis of potential impact of new wells on emission of greenhouse gases such as methane. The area around Alt is so fracked. It's so fracked. Please just give them a break. We already have severe ozone non-attainment in that area. We have so many new health studies that are showing the impacts of miles away and the impacts of wells surrounding people. And you heard from Carol what it's like. I guess that's all I have to say. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Christensen. We appreciate you being with us and presenting to us yet again today. Okay, that is the public comment that signed up for the Bayswater application. I believe we now will turn to the Bayswater application itself. It's docket 2107 00120. And I believe we first will hear from Jason Maxey.
Thank you, Chair Robbins, and good morning to you and the commission and staff and everybody attending. As always, I appreciate being able to have just a few minutes on these Weld County docketed items to talk about certain things that are pertinent to Weld County and our permitting process, and any other questions that might come up from the commission or anybody else in attendance. These comments are in regards to your docket item for the Bayswater Ruby 7J pad, which is assigned WOGLA number 1041 WOGLA 20-0073. Weld County submitted comments to the COGCC on April 6th of 2022, and those are reflected in the Form 2A that should be in your packet. The application was submitted to Weld County on November 12th, 2020. So that's a year and a half ago. And I want to make mention that that was prior to our now required pre-application process. That was prior to the new COGCC rules, which took effect in January of 2021. And that was also prior to the new Weld County and COGCC MOU, which was signed in April of 2021. However, even though this was submitted prior to those items happening, through the Weld County process, we did have an in-depth alternate siting discussion with Bayswater on July 23rd, 2020. And the applicant ultimately included 4 alternates in their application, all of which were thoroughly reviewed and discussed by Weld County staff, including the hearing officer during the hearing. Excuse me. The COGCC and the CPW were both sent referral requests. However, Weld County did not receive responses from either of these agencies. No public comments or applications for intervention were received by Weld County staff through the process that we have outlined in code. We held our hearing on January 7th of 2021, and a final order was issued by the hearing officer and was recorded with the county clerk and recorder on January 13th, 2021. And final notice was in the Greeley Tribune on January 15th, 2021. So Bayswater's permit has also had a recent amendment with Weld County, which was March 2nd of 2022. Now, what this amendment did was it did modify the well count, excuse me, and the proposed equipment count, along with a little bit of disturbance area, which now aligns better with the Form 2A and the OGDP that is in front of you. So in addition to the 1041 permit that we evaluated, we have also had that one amendment. And as our submitted comments state, and as Director Murphy's recommendations reflect, Weld County would support approval of this permit. And just as a side note to a few of the public comments that were made, number one, definitely appreciate the public's input in not only the state's process, but also Weld County's process. I believe the commission knows how much Weld County tries to engage the public. In fact, a little less than a year ago, we expanded our outreach to the public. But I just want to make mention of a couple comments that were said by Carol Hawkins. And Carol and I have known each other since early 2019 from a community meeting, and she and I have had many conversations in person, on the phone, and a lot via email. And while we try to accurately answer questions from residents and engage, there are certain things that I think have been misconstrued, and I just want to give Weld County's perspective on a few of the comments that were mentioned. Regarding the forced pooling from PDC, there was a community meeting held in early 2019. That was a meeting that I requested PDC hold due to that forced pooling notice that was sent to many residents in the town of Ault. PDC agreed, and we held a community meeting, and that helped with a lot of the community discussion and interaction. As far as drilling behind the school, Highland School, that's just not accurate. There are no surface permits either issued or under consideration from Weld County within 3,500 feet of the school. That's minimum. There is one P&A well west of the school. That's over 800 feet away from the school's property line. That's the only thing that I could point to say that there's any type of oil and gas activity close to school property. And the last thing to mention regarding distances away and community input and Weld County engagement with community, again, to me, it doesn't matter how far away somebody is. If they have questions about oil and gas, we will do our best to answer them all the time, no matter how far away they are from development. But regarding this development here, Bayswater, the Ruby pad, Ms. Hawkins is over 8,000 feet away from the Bayswater location and well outside of any Weld County or COGCC notification radius for this permit. And so again, we will try to always accommodate questions and answers and point them in the right direction for those curiosities or for those concerns or for whatever they might have regarding oil and gas. But as far as being noticed or being a part of this hearing, well outside of the boundaries of notification. So I just wanted to address a few of the comments that Ms. Hawkins brought up, because I think that a few of them might have been not accurate in the interactions between her and I. And I'd be happy to address any of those type of questions, or if Ms. Hawkins is still on the line, she knows I'm always willing to respond to her questions or comments off on the side as well. So I hope that that's been helpful regarding this application. If there are any other questions that the commission has, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Maxey. Appreciate your being with us and providing perspective on this particular application. I think some of the information that we received in public comment was a little not as much directed at this application. And I think the commissioners, we understand that, and we appreciate full-on public comment for sure. And I know you do too. And so I appreciate your comments in that regard. And I'll encourage Ms. Hawkins to reach out to you if she felt like your correction of the record was incorrect. And so we'll leave that as it is. Do any commissioners have questions of Mr. Maxey? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Maxey, for being here. I read over the final order that was provided by Weld County on this particular application, and note that this one, like others, includes a provision in there that the applicant will not flare gas at the location. I wonder how Weld County handles combustion of emissions coming off of tanks, either well tanks or oil tanks, or produced water tanks, and if that is prohibited under that provision in the final order.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. And you're referencing the inability to vent or flare gas from the facility in general, correct?
Yeah, I'm just reading it off of your final order. Indicates that the number 6. Okay, I don't think it actually is number 6.
Right. So our code is general in the venting and flaring of natural gas as well as air permitting. What we say in our code is that the operator shall comply with applicable state and federal rules regarding venting and flaring of natural gas, and facilities and equipment which are sources of air emissions shall be authorized to operate in accordance with their APIN, their air pollution emissions notice, from the CDPHE, AQCC, et cetera. So our code references back to state and or other permitting sources. In the COGCC rules, I believe it's somewhere in the 900 series, 903 potentially, is some venting and flaring language as well. So that is what we reference back to in this case here. The hearing officer does ask questions such as that to get the applicant on the record as far as it for the Weld County permit, even though we refer to state and or federal permitting as well, just to get them on the record. And so when he writes in there in certain times of no venting or flaring of gas, that's what it's in reference to. But as far as what Weld County would actively manage, there would not necessarily be an active management of that, since it's a default to the state and or federal levels.
Thank you for that answer.
Further questions? Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Maxey, for some background that you gave today. This is just kind of a general question, and I've been thinking about this a lot as I've been reviewing OGDPs, and kind of what is Weld County's perspective on trying to reduce not only the footprint of an oil and gas location, but potentially trying to encourage operators to go tankless, and how that's contemplated as part of your review.
Thank you for that question as well. So Number one, when we're talking about footprints of oil and gas locations, that obviously is something that is worked out with the operator and the surface owner, as you all know, because that's generally a part of their SUA agreement. We try to encourage as small of a footprint as possible, especially since so much oil and gas development is in active farmed ground, active irrigated ground. I come from a farming background. My family farm has some oil and gas development on it that has been there for a long time that I was not a part of, but my grandfather had to deal with. And when you're looking at an actively farmed area, the surface owner normally wants that to be as small of an impact as possible. And I quite honestly flat out agree with that. Weld County is #1 in agricultural production in the state of Colorado, and we're ranked well within the top 10 nationally. And so the attempt to try to preserve as much farmable ground as possible is always at the forefront of our mind when we're looking at surface impacts in these applications. When we're talking about tankless designs or tankless facilities, that has been a routine question of ours throughout the process, as well as the hearing officer, to ask about pipeline takeaway. If the answer is that no infrastructure is in place for pipeline takeaway that would allow for more of a tankless design at the time of the application, then the conversation usually evolves and turns to, when do you think that might happen? While we can't put that in an order and hold the operator to timeframes that they might not have answers to definitively, that is always a part of the conversation. And it is, back to your point, it is in the essence of trying to make these locations as small as possible. And as a side answer to that, that obviously is another thing that we look at and you all look at too, even just regarding cumulative impacts, because anytime we can add on to an existing location and not have a brand new surface disturbance, that's one of the primary reasons to talk about cumulative impacts and trying to commingle some of these locations. And sometimes it works. We heard about one of those a few weeks back with a Bonanza case that I testified to. They did expand an existing location, which helps with cumulative impacts. In other cases, that's not possible. So all those things I think kind of play into your question that you asked, but we definitely take a look and we have those conversations about pipeline takeaway, the size of the facilities, the importance of agriculture ground or any ground within Weld County to try to make these as small and minimal as possible to decrease the impact to that surface owner and to the surrounding area.
Thanks.
That's for the answers to the commissioner's questions. We do appreciate your attendance at these meetings on these important OGDPs.
Thank you very much.
Seeing no further questions, I believe we will now recognize Mr. Prashella as well as his team.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, commissioners. My name is Joe Prashella with Wellborn, Sullivan, Meck and Tooley, and I am the attorney on behalf of Bayswater Exploration and Production. With me today are Lauren Walsh, the regulatory manager at Bayswater. She will be handling the meat of the presentation. And then we will also have available for commissioner questions Tyler Hammond, who's landman, Brad Rogers, the environmental manager, Jeff Overman, drilling manager, Ryan Kaminke, the production manager, Robert Carney, completions manager, and Steve Struan, president of Bayswater. Bayswater's been before you previously on OGDP. So as you know, they are a registered operator and remain in good standing with the commission and has met all financial assurances that are required by the state of Colorado. Bayswater's application requests that the commission approve an oil and gas development plan that covers approximately 3,555 acres in Township 7 North, ranges 65 and 66 West, which, as you know, is in Weld County. The oil and gas development plan includes one new oil and gas location. It's the Ruby 7J pad, from which Bayswater intends to drill 32 new horizontal wells. The wells would be located in 2 drilling and spacing units, each comprised of approximately 1,280 acres, and that's for production from the Niobrara, Fort Hays, Codell, and Carlisle formations. The first DSU covers sections 11 and 12, 7 North, range 66 West, and there would be 16 new horizontal wells within that DSU. And again, all 16 of those wells would be from the Ruby pad. The second DSU is an existing DSU established by order number 407-2579, and that was for the Niobrara and Codell formations and covers sections 7 and 8, Township 7 North, Range 65 West. That DSU would be amended to add the Fort Hayes and Carlisle formations to account for any wellbore deviations out of the Codell formation. There would be 10 new horizontal wells in that DSU, all of which would be drilled from the Ruby pad. With respect to this DSU, I do want to note that there are already 7 producing horizontal wells in the unit. Those wells were drilled from the East Alt 18C pad. That there will be no additional wells drilled from that pad, but because they are producing wells, that pad is developing the DSU. It was included in the OGDP application. In addition to the 2 drilling and spacing units, Bayswater is requesting approval of 6 wellbore specific boundary spacing units, each of approximately 640 acres. So there would be 2 boundary units along the northern boundary of drilling and spacing unit number 2. The boundary units cover the same lands, but 1 for each of the wells. There are 2 boundary units along the southern boundary of the drilling and spacing unit number 2. And again, they would cover the same lands, but 1 well per boundary unit. And then there are another 2 boundary units along the northern boundary of the first drilling and spacing unit. Bayswater has secured more than 45% of the leasehold in the DSUs and the wellbore units, and is therefore an owner with the right to drill and produce in the application lands. The Ruby 7J pad is on fee surface, and it's in a rural part of Weld County. There are no residential building units, schools, or other receptors within 2,000 feet of the pad, and it does not meet any of the Rule 304 B2B criteria that would otherwise require an alternative location analysis. Bayswater has a surface use agreement with the surface owner and has met with the owner regarding the siting of the pad. Of note is that the pad sits on the boundary of 2 parcels that are both owned by the surface owner. That surface owner granted a waiver of Rule 604A2 requirement that a well not be located closer than 150 feet to the property line. But again, that owner is the owner of both of the parcels. As you heard from Mr. Maxey, that Weld County is the relevant local government and approved the Ruby 7J pad at 1041 WOGLA 20-0073. There are no proximate local governments. Bayswater is not requesting any variances. The application did not seek any lesser impact exemptions. Notice was properly given pursuant to Rules 303E and 504. We've had no petitions or interventions filed with respect to the application. And as you heard from Mr. Maxey as well, that on May 31st, 2022, the director issued a very thorough and detailed director recommendation, which recommends approval of Bayswater's application. The application satisfies the Conservation Act and Commission rules, and therefore Bayswater would request that the Commission adopt the director's recommendation and approve the application. I will turn this on over to Ms. Walsh, who will introduce you again to Bayswater and give you an overview of the Ruby Oil and Gas Development Plan. And as I noted, Mr. Hammond, Rogers, Overman, Kaminke, Carney, and Mr. Struna are also available for questions.
Thank you for the overview, Ms. Walsh.
Thank you, Joe. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys. Can you see my presentation?
We can.
Excellent. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Lauren Walsh, and I'm a Senior Regulatory Specialist and Landman at Bayswater. Today, I'll be presenting our Ruby 7J OGDP. I'll take you through several topics regarding our OGDP today, including a company overview, an introduction, proposed location with an overview map, 304 B2B ALA criteria, as well as an internal alternate location analysis. We'll continue with a permitting timeline, best management practices, including air emission reduction BMPs, local government partnership, and conclude with a summary. To begin, I'd like to go over an introduction to Bayswater, our team, our business values, and our commitment to sustainability. Bayswater was established in 2004. We have a 37-person headquartered office in Denver and a 16-person field office in Eaton, Colorado. We also operate in West Texas and have an 8-person field organization in Coahoma. Our business values include having a long-term business perspective. This is evident by the fact that we have been an active DJ driller with a continuous one rig program since June of 2017. We also added a second rig in April of 2022. We have drilled over 250 horizontal DJ wells. And while we do not plan to plug any offset wells as part of our OGDP, as determined by our offset well evaluation, we have plugged 81 of our 97 vertical well inventory. We also fit into an option 1 financial assurance operator designation. We strive to maintain value for Bayswater and the communities in which we operate through executional excellence and a strong mutually advantageous business relationship. In fact, the Ruby 7J pad will contribute to beneficial cumulative impacts to their surrounding communities by royalties paid to local Weld County mineral owners and contributions to local employment opportunities for individuals and vendors. This will be through pre-production and production phases of operations. Finally, we have a strong commitment to sustainability. And we believe that the development of oil and natural gas and the stewardship of sustainable environment are not mutually exclusive. We know that affordable and reliable energy is vital for the US and the world, and that we require a social license to operate. We work hard to gain trust of the communities where we operate and ensure that our actions always reinforce that trust. To kick off a detailed explanation of the proposed location, we've prepared this overview map. The proposed Ruby 7J location is shown as a red star, with the proposed access road shown as the yellow dotted line about 2,100 feet north of Highway 14. The town of Alt can be seen here in yellow, approximately 2,200 feet west of our proposed location. The 2 red dotted rectangles depict the 2 DSUs that Joe mentioned that will be developed by 32 wells drilled from a single surface location. When Bayswater first began planning to develop these DSUs, we intended to do so from 2 separate locations, one to drill 2 miles east and the other 2 miles west. Those are both shown as blue stars on this map. Those 2 SUAs have since been released and replaced by the red star, owned by the same surface owner. Next, please note that the proposed Ruby 7J location does not trigger any 304 B2B criteria, which would require an alternative location analysis as part of our OGDP. We have listed each of the 10 criteria along with the respective distances from the Ruby location. Next to the criteria, you can see a buffer map of the Ruby location with dotted circles depicting 500 feet, 1,000 feet, and 2,000 foot buffers from our working pad surface. Bayswater worked diligently to find a location that was mutually beneficial with the surface owner and that was outside of 2,000 feet from any RBUs. Let me call to your attention that there is a building 1,802 feet west of our working pad surface. It's a little green square you can see on the edge of the picture. This building is an uninhabited barn and does not meet any COGCC definitions of an RBU. Other criteria that were pivotal in the selection of this proposed location are that it is not within a floodplain, not within a high priority habitat, and not within 2,000 feet of a disproportionately impacted community. Although not required by rule, Bayswater did perform our own alternative location analysis to ensure that our proposed Ruby 7J location was the best option for all parties involved. Some history on our planning to develop these lands is that we did execute 2 SUAs to develop the 2 adjacent DSUs in August of 2019. And this was from the surface owner's preferred 2 locations. Both locations were within 2,000 feet of RBUs. We began surveying and permitting of these locations. Anticipating Senate Bill 19181 changes to setback requirements Bayswater proactively considered alternative locations. We worked with the surface owner to find a creative alternative location and released our prior SUAs in April of 2020. The development of all lands from a single location is beneficial because it meets all setback requirements, creates better land use, and reduces cumulative impacts. The planning and permitting process for the Ruby 7J pad has been underway since August of 2019, when we first executed those 2 original SUAs. Some of these key permitting details include when we submitted our first Form 2A and it received a completeness determination by COGCC in November of 2020, before the passage of Senate Bill 19-181. In December of 2020, we were advised by COGCC that the Form 2A would not be approved prior to the new rule implementation. In January of 2021, we received an approved final order 1041 WOGLA from Weld County. Shortly thereafter, on January 15th, 2021, Senate Bill 19-181 rules were implemented. In July of 2021, 10 plus months ago, Bayswater resubmitted our application as an OGDP. Following that, our application was returned to draft twice and resubmitted to address all staff questions. Completeness was granted in March of 2022. And finally, on June 1st, 2022, we received the director's explicit recommendation for approval. Bayswater prides itself in being best in class in our best management practices, some of which we have included here. We will implement 32-foot high engineered sound and light walls to wrap the perimeter of the location on all sides during drilling and completion phases of operations. We will also implement permanently installed 14-foot high engineered sound walls to be placed west of the gas lift compressor equipment during production phases of operations. All lighting will be directed downwards and inwards to reduce the light impact of the surrounding RBUs. We will also utilize a quiet frac fleet and sandbox technology to mitigate noise, dust, and air impacts during our completions operations. All produced oil and gas will be connected to permanent pipeline, and all fresh water will be delivered to location for completion operations by temporary layflat pipeline, thereby eliminating associated emissions with dust, traffic, and truck delivery. Many of our BMPs are geared specifically towards reducing emissions. Those BMPs include that electrical power will be connected at the production site to power a portion of the production facility, which will reduce noise and air emissions. Instrument air will be utilized to run pneumatic devices to reduce fugitive emissions. Weekly and monthly LDAR and AVO inspections will mitigate potential emissions by early detection and repair. Continuous air monitoring utilizing Project Canary technology will provide additional alerts on any VOCs, particulate, and methane readings above background levels from pre-construction through production. All gas and vapor are captured, compressed, and sold into the sales line, including from oil and water production tanks and vent gas arising from compressor maintenance and repair. Thief hatches and atmospheric tanks used for crude oil storage will be closed, latched, and sealed during normal operations. Tanks will function as sealed and ventless with gas release during normal operations only through an eco-vapor control system. Field-wide stormwater management and spill prevention plans are in place to mitigate and manage all surface disturbance areas and any spills if they were to occur. Additionally, the proposed facility includes the use of 10 oil tanks. These are for storage purposes only to manage potential interruption to oil pipeline takeaway that could be outside of Bayswater's control. It is not feasible for this location to be tankless because Bayswater does not own and operate our own oil gathering system. We sell to a third party with the sales point on location, and we are required to meet crude oil specs at a third party lacked. Our low pressure tanks allow this oil a final flash point to meet those specs. Additionally, during ozone action days, emission impacts will be monitored and reduced to pose minimal change to existing conditions. This includes sending alerts to our production team and limiting well unloading and maintenance operations, as well as non-emergency work requiring tanks, vessels, and flow line maintenance whenever operationally feasible. Bayswater is committing to being a good neighbor and to building long-standing relationships with key stakeholders, including municipalities. We have had a great deal of engagement with the town of Alt, which includes holding an introductory meeting with the mayor and town clerk in August of 2020. We also engaged the town by sending a courtesy relevant and local proximate government notice for the Ruby 7J OGDP in February of 2021. And we also invited them to attend a rig tour in July of 2021. We also have a strong relationship with surrounding municipal leaders such as Eaton and Severance. In summary, Bayswater is pleased to present our Ruby 7J Pad 2 today and believes that it is the best location to develop the minerals from for many reasons, including that we went to lengths to place the location outside of 2,000 feet from RBUs and not to trigger any 304 B2B criteria, that the development of the minerals from one location reduces cumulative impacts, that we have first-class comprehensive BMPs, that we've engaged in local government outreach efforts, and finally, that the director did recommend this application for approval. Thank you all very much for your time. And at this point, we will take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Ms. Walsh. Appreciate the presentation. Talk to me a little bit about the original surface use locations and then the subsequent surface use locations. Was that the same surface owner?
Yes, sir, it is the same surface owner. So originally we chose the two locations to develop the two DSUs because those were the preferred locations for the surface owner that were best for the farming activities in the field and least disruptive. When we realized that we were going to need to put the location outside of 2,000 feet, we went back to him and talked about some creative solutions and actually found a spot in between those other two locations that we originally hadn't considered because there was an active irrigation pond there.
Thank you. I have a dog barking, so I'm muting on and off. Okay, commissioners, we have the panel before us. Do we have additional questions? Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. And I appreciate that we're, going from a two pad location down to one. I think from a cumulative perspective, that's preferable. I did have, and I appreciate you trying to address some of the questions I had in your presentation, and I think I just might need some more clarification. So thank you for bearing with me here. So the oil tanks that you have on site, and I guess it's just going to be kind of a common question for me as a commissioner because we're dealing with ozone issues and emissions are important and trying to minimize those as much as possible. And I think that it's also possible to minimize our footprint when we're able to go tankless. My understanding is that from your testimony, the tanks are for storage purposes. So for example, if the pipeline becomes unavailable, you need to store it somewhere. It is not necessary to have those tanks for further separation purposes, but then I think I did hear you say that it was being used for that. So can you clarify, are the tanks for storage purposes only, or are they also needed for final separation before the product goes into the pipeline?
Yes, ma'am. They are used for storage purposes only. There is no separation that occurs in those 10 oil tanks.
Okay, thank you. And so 10 oil tanks seems like a lot. So can you just talk to me a little bit about why you need 10 if they're for storage purposes only?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the number of tanks that our facilities engineers have found as necessary because we don't operate midstream. If there was to be a disruption in the midstream, we want to be able to continue to produce the wells, and the safest way to do that is to be able to put the oil in those 10 tanks that are on location.
So thank you. How long, and I've asked this of a previous operator, so I just want to clarify. The expectation is if the pipeline, for whatever reason, cannot take the product, you use the storage tanks. We're not using that as a delivery system anymore. We're just using it because you want to keep producing the wells and not shut them in temporarily?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
How long does that, how long of a time do those 10 storage tanks give you?
You know, that's a great question. And I think I'm going to have our production manager, Ryan Kaminke, answer that detailed question for you.
Hi there, Ryan Kaminke here. Based on 10 tanks, they are 500 barrels each. Based on the large well count that we would expect here, at peak production, this would allow for approximately 12 hours of storage. So, looking back at Bayswater's history, we've had sites where we've had upwards of 18 or 20 oil tanks. We've looked at and evaluated with the third-party midstream to go tankless, and due to technical and engineering requirements between our tanks and their pump control, we've determined that it's just not technically feasible given the third-party operated LACs. So what we call a tank light system, where we try and reduce tanks, but we do allow for we target about 12 hours of storage. And, we're not intending to, we would never truck from this location. It's just more of a what if scenario. If the third party cannot take oil, then we would continue flowing for up to those 12 hours.
But then after the 12, you'd still have to shut in, because now you're in a situation where you can't send it down, midstream anywhere. So you got 12 hours for 10 tanks.
Correct, and typically it's the we don't see interruptions that are more than 12 hours. It's usually minutes to hours, but it allows us the ability to store during those upset conditions.
Okay. I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate that you did try to look at going tankless. I think that hopefully moving into the future, we're going to see fewer and fewer of these types of setups. I think that those tanks with the thief hatches are opportunities for emissions. We're in a non-attainment area now. I think we need to figure out how to do our part to meet our ozone expectations. And that leads into my next question. And I appreciate that you covered what you would try to do on high ozone days. And I'm wondering if we can add that as an actual BMP to your permit.
Yes, ma'am, and it actually already is included.
Is it? Okay, I missed that. I
No
apologize.
problem.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Additional questions?
Chair?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, Commissioner Gonzalez, you were over to the side.
That's all right. No, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation today. I want to piggyback on Commissioner McGowan's question about the tanks. That they're sized probably appropriately so for peak production, right? And for that 12 hours during peak production. Is there any modular nature to the tank battery setup that would allow for when it gets into kind of its post peak production, so kind of down the decline curve, for removing any of those tanks in the future?
Yes, so that's something we continually work through on older facilities. I'd mentioned we'd had facilities in the past that we developed in 2016 and 17 that had truck takeaway that had upwards of 18 to 20 tanks. Once we do get into more of the flatter decline of the oil production, we are going back and we basically remove and shrink the footprint. For that pad that we did have 18 tanks, we pulled 10 of them off to utilize on other facilities. So yes, a lot of our equipment we do size for peak production, but 1 to 2 years down the road, we are looking at reducing equipment, pulling off vapor compression, and looking at bulk and test setups to reduce our overall footprint. It's from a flow capacity standpoint, a lot of equipment is required to handle peak production.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I understand that, right? I mean, you can't. It's the nature of production and the decline curve. Would that be something you guys would consider putting as a BMP, as kind of a revisit in 2 years to look at the necessity of having that number of tanks on site?
yes, from my side, on the engineering side, we're definitely comfortable committing to that and revisiting that, as we're already actively doing that across the field.
Yeah, it sounds like you are, and it sounds like that's a good practice anyway. Specifically, you know, when we're not able to commit to tankless designs, and that's, you know, that's the nature of going to third party takeaway, right? I understand that, but if we can have some commitment in the future to say, hey, we're going to revisit this, we're going to pull the tanks, so we don't need reduce that footprint, I think that would be appropriate and appreciated.
And just to follow up on that, I agree that we would definitely be willing to add that as 2 years to reconsider reducing the footprint.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for the presentation. I had a couple of questions. One is, in your presentation and in the application, it indicates that, you know, all gas and vapors will be captured, you know, compressed and piped. But then it also says that tank gas released would be combusted utilizing a eco vapor control. So I'm trying to understand which it is.
To clarify there, the eco vapor system actually, I don't, if it was combust, that was used in the language there, it's actually compressed and then sent into sales. So with the utilization of you know, we've gone away from typical thief hatches and gone to lockdown thief hatches on all of our oil and water tanks. Any vapor that we do see on the oil and water tanks are compressed. It's one of, you know, 3 separate stages of compression, and then we are compressing that back up into sales pressure.
Okay, so there is no combustion associated with any of the gas or vapors in this particular application. Is that correct?
Correct.
Besides whatever would be allowable within the rules, right? I mean, there are certain situations that would be allowed, but.
Correct. We do permit a certain, you know, upset condition. We do, you know, we see very high runtime with the electric compression we have, but we still plan for some downtime.
The other question I had, and I was just kind of curious about it. In the application, it indicated that there was going to be a biofuel completion fleet utilized. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that biofuel completion unit and which fuel that they would use and how that tied into your cumulative impacts report.
This is Robert Carney. I assume that Lauren would want me to field this question. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. So the biofuel would be a natural gas and then also a diesel fuel. And all the pumps that we are going to use on this site are what's considered tier 4 diesel and biofuel. Traditionally, we haven't utilized much natural gas with this particular fleet because from an emission standpoint, it's kind of moot or slightly better depending on how you look at it, and to use just diesel fuel on these tier 4 diesel engines. So and then I'm not really sure how that was put into the application.
Yeah, my question there was just if there was a difference in emissions between natural gas and diesel with the biofuel completions unit, which fuel was calculated in your emissions calculation for the cumulative impacts report. But it sounds like, at least what I think I'm hearing, is the diesel engines that are utilized in this tier 4 completion system have similar, if not better, emissions than the natural gas, so it may not be an issue on the cumulative impacts report.
Yeah, that's correct, and maybe Lauren could touch on that a little bit. I'm not sure what was put in the cumulative impact.
I actually think. Sorry, who was that? I kept hearing someone talk when I was talking. Anyways, I think that Brad Rogers might be able to address the cumulative impact calculations there. But yeah, Brad, are you aware of the difference that we use for the biofuel in any of those calculations?
But in the application for the emissions that were calculated was using diesel tier 4 emission factors for that.
Great. Thank you. I don't have any further questions. Thank you for answering mine.
Others with questions for the panel? All right, seeing no further questions, I believe we now move to the deliberation stage for this OGDP. Does any commissioner desire to initiate deliberations? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, having reviewed the application and the director's recommendation, also reviewing the local government recommendation, you know, I do think that this application meets the requirements in our rules. I do appreciate the added BMP that was considered by Bayswater and suggested by Commissioner Gonzalez around eliminating tanks after peak production as the decline curve, as the operations enter the decline curve. I think that makes sense. And I appreciate that all vapors and gas are being compressed and into a sales line, both from tanks, produced water tanks, any oil tanks, and anything else associated with the operation. So I think that's a good thing. I will note that as people seem to always be interested in this topic, that after completion was determined, it's in front of us in approximately 90 days, which has been a consistent time frame and one that I think is appropriate for review, technical review of these applications. And while we often get accused of having long review periods, again, I think this one is coming in 90 days, which is appropriate. And so with that, I would move approval of this application.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, panel. Thank you, Bayswater, for the presentation, and we have now approved the OGDP that was before us.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you, Mr. Struna. Appreciate you being with us as well. Okay, Commissioners, we have two other matters on our docket today. A PDC OGDP and then a variance request. It is 11:40, almost 11:45. What's your pleasure? Do we want to take a lunch break now? I think the PDC is likely to take a little bit of time, and so it might make more sense to say take 45 minutes now and come back at 12:30, and then we can start up on the afternoon with our two remaining items. Is everybody okay with that? All right, then we will not adjourn, we will stop holding our hearing for 45 minutes and we will return at 12:45. All right, Commissioners, welcome back. It is 12:45. We will return to our docket. We are taking up 2109-00171. a OGDP application by PDC. I believe that looks like we've got some of PDC folks on the panel. I believe we were initially going to listen or hear from Jason Maxey, as has been our normal course of action. So with that, Mr. Maxey, if you'd like to provide your perspective, Weld County's perspective on this OGDP, we're happy to hear it.
All right, well, good afternoon. Thank you, Chair Robbins and the rest of the commission and staff again for allowing Weld County to participate and give some comments on the docket item in front of you. Just a couple quick notes. I do have another meeting at 1, so I'm going to try to make these comments within the 10 minutes that we asked for. If there's any follow-up questions throughout the rest of the hearing, though, I do have one of my teammates online, Kelly Holiday, and so she could help answer those questions, which may even be better anyways, because she was the one internally who worked on this application for Weld County. So this is for the PDC Energy Kenosha OGDP at the state, but with Weld County, we process this as a CDP. It's one of our smaller comprehensive development plans that we do. But since these 3 locations are close to each other, we processed it as an overall 1 hearing CDP. And I'll get into some of the details a little bit below. The WOGLA number that was associated was 1041 WOGLA 21-0007. We did submit comments on the 2A on March 9th, 2022 for all 3 locations. However, unfortunately, the comments were not reflected on the COGCC Form 2A or attached to the final director recommendation. Unfortunately, this was some of the locations that were in the little system glitch that we noticed and tried to re-upload comments. However, we did resend those to Sabrina Trask, and Doug Andrews helped out with getting those uploaded. So I just wanted to make mention that we did submit those on March 9th of this year. They weren't initially included, but they should be a part of the record now. So appreciate Sabrina and Doug for helping rectify that situation. The Kenosha CDP application for Weld County is made up of 3 oil and gas locations, which include the Hen, Drake, and George, which are a part of the OGDP that you are reviewing. A pre-application meeting was held on April 21st of 2021, so a year ago, with an in-depth alternative siting discussion on each of the 3 locations. Attendees at that meeting included oil and gas Weld County staff, PDC staff, COGCC staff, and CPW staff. So we ran this as what is typical now for a required pre-application meeting, and all the necessary and relevant parties were in attendance. We received the formal application on December 13th of 2021, and our hearing was scheduled for March 3rd, 2022. Now, something that's a little bit different with how we somewhat look at CDPs and how we notify out to the public that is a little bit different than our code requirements. Since these are usually a little bit bigger plans, there's a little bit more impact in the area. We continue to send out notice of our hearing, and we continue to publish the hearing in the Greeley Tribune for CDPs. However, we mailed out 86 individual notices to property owners who were either impacted by haul routes or who were within 2,000 feet of the oil and gas location. And again, just to be very definitive, the oil and gas location definition for Weld County encompasses the entirety of the disturbance area, not just the COGCC defined working pad surface. So it's safe to say that for this proposal in front of you, more individuals were noticed through the Weld County permitting process than potentially the COGCC notices that went out. Now, we did receive no formal public comments or applications for interventions through our process. We were contacted, though, by several residents asking for clarification on the exact parcels that these specific 3 locations were sited on. So there was a little bit of curiosity about the exact locations. Since we did send out so many notices, we had a few people that wanted to just know that information. In our discussions with them, once they understood the precise location, no further concerns were expressed. We did also meet with a small group of residents who had some questions regarding the Drake location specifically. So one of the 3 locations, we received some phone calls and questions from about 3 or 4 households that were close to the Drake location. And so Weld County requested a meeting with those residents and with PDC. And we had that meeting actually at one of the residents' homes in the middle of the day to talk to them about what their questions or concerns were. Their questions and concerns were predominantly related to traffic and the proposed haul route. And so after that meeting and after PDC heard some of the discussion and Weld County heard that discussion, we came back as Weld County staff and we wanted to set up a meeting with our Public Works Department to talk about the haul route that was proposed for the Drake location. And PDC was involved in that meeting as well with our Public Works Department. That meeting, it was determined that the proposed haul route for that location was in fact the safest haul route. And it also was the one that utilized county infrastructure to the highest extent possible for roadways. However, based on the discussions and concerns from those residents at that meeting, PDC was able to move the Drake location's access point to be less impactful to the nearest residential building unit. And even though no referral response was received from the school district, we had conversations with PDC and in our process, they agreed to coordinate operational traffic with the school bus schedule in the area to avoid traffic impacts during that school bus time and pickup and drop off times. So that's a positive that was realized from these meetings. We received no agency referral comments indicating any conflicts or disagreement with the 3 proposed locations. The hearing officer considered testimony at the hearing and subsequently approved this 1041 WOGLA CDP permit on March 3rd, 2022. The final order was recorded with the county clerk and recorder on March 17th, 2022, and it was published as the final notice in the Greeley Tribune on March 19th. Now, one thing that's different about our CDP process compared to our individual WOGLAs is that even though we have a hearing on the overall boundaries of the CDP, we do not have specific information for each of the locations within CDPs. We call those site-specific applications. And so in the case of this Kenosha application, at least 90 days prior to construction for each individual location, PDC will submit site-specific 1041 information detailing elements specific to each of the 3 locations, the Hen, Drake, and George. At that time, those pieces of the application that are specific will be administratively evaluated and considered for approval, but the hearing officer is the one who approves the overall plan. And as long as the locations within that plan do not substantially change or move, then those individual locations can be administratively approved for the specific items within those individual applications. Just real quick on the public comments received by the COGCC. I know the director's recommendation recognized them, and I believe PDC addressed them as well. They're mainly focused on some utilization of fresh water during operations, proximity to surface waters, residential building units. No such concerns were presented during the Weld County permitting process. And again, you heard how many notices we sent out to affected not only building unit owners, but property owners, along with people along haul routes. And so we received none of those comments through our process. And Weld County Code also does not require operators to utilize recycled water as part of their operations. And we also do not regulate the source of water utilized during operations. We do require a grading and drainage plan be submitted for each individual location. And without written permission, no drainage is allowed into any irrigation ditches without that written permission from those ditch owners. All Weld County drainage plans are reviewed and approved by a professional engineer, which is registered with the state of Colorado. And so just to sum up, in final comment, as stated in Director Murphy's comments and staff report, and although not included initially, our comments on the 2As, but as you heard me say at the very beginning, they are now part of the record. We would definitely recommend approval of this permit and would appreciate any questions or comments that you might have for Weld County and the process that I outlined. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maxey. Any questions for Mr. Maxey? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you again, Mr. Maxey, for being here and sharing with us the Weld County review process. A couple of questions about the CDP review and then how it ties into the site-specific review. and the notice goes out to the landowners, the residents during the CDP process. Is the expectation is if they need to share any information or want to be present at the hearing, that they do it at the CDP level, or do they have an opportunity to share their thoughts at the site-specific review level?
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. And yes, you're correct in what you stated, that the expectation is that notice that goes out for the entirety of the plan, that larger overall area, that public input would be held and entertained at that time. And that during the site-specific review, the locations, again, within the CDP are looked at and the alternates are discussed during the hearing and during that overall review. But as long as that location does not change within that CDP approval, then the site-specific locations are basically an internal review to make sure that the applicant, in this case PDC, has abided by all the remaining Weld County code requirements and that they are within those regulations. And so there is no input or notice that is sent during those times. Now, if a location does change within a CDP, meaning that the surface area should move, or if the well count or the equipment count and proposals significantly change on a location, then we have historically told operators that those would be pulled from the original CDP approval, and those would get ran as a normal 1041 WOGLA, which you all are well familiar with. But as long as they don't disturb additional land, as long as it stays in the same location, as long as they're not adding wells, things like that, then it is just strictly an internal review process that we make sure that they abide by the remainder of the code requirements for Weld County.
Okay, thank you for that. My other question is around produced water takeaway. I think I read in the Weld County order that that acknowledges that the proposal includes trucking produced water up until there is produced water takeaway. Was it Weld County's expectation that there be developed a produced water takeaway, or is that I guess what was that discussion during the Weld County hearing process?
During the Weld County process, produced water takeaway is something that we're seeing more of recently. It's historically not been very common that there is pipeline infrastructure that is taking away produced water from locations. But since we have started hearing about it fairly recently, it has become a part of the questioning about, is there that ability and what is the operator's plan for produced water takeaway, whether that's via trucks or potentially pipelines. So again, when the hearing officer is asking the questions, he's just trying to get ahead of getting the applicant on record as far as what those plans are. We did not put any restrictions, as far as I remember, on this permit saying they had to do one thing or the other. It's just trying to get that information on the record. And in this case, if memory serves correctly, there is no produced water pipeline infrastructure in the area right now. But the operator did mention that if that were to be something in the future that was a possibility, that they would definitely utilize that in the future. Again, a little hard to nail down in an order just because of the kind of ambiguous nature and the timelines of not knowing that infrastructure improvements, but wanted to at least get the conversation on record.
Okay, thank you for answering my questions.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Anybody else for Mr. Maxey? All right, seeing none, it is 1 o'clock. Go to your next meeting. We've got your associate if we need them.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, Mr. Pashala, before I recognize you, I meant to make this statement at the beginning and I forgot, but basically I wanted to alert and put on the record that on May 19th and May 24th, commissioners individually visited the proposed locations for the Kenosha OGDP. The purpose of these visits was to allow commissioners an opportunity to see the proposed locations and surrounding features and to prepare for this hearing. Members of COGCC staff and representatives of PDC also attended these site visits. Before the site visits, both the commission and PDC signed a site visit protocol document, which laid out the process for the visits to ensure compliance with open meetings law and commission rules. Pursuant to that document, only one commissioner attended a site visit at a time. Commissioners did not travel to or from the site visits together, and commissioners did not discuss the site visits with each other. COGCC staff attended the site visits to aid commissioners in identifying the locations of proposed features and facilities, such as residential building units. PDC representatives attended only to provide factual detail where necessary to answer a commissioner question. We also had Assistant Attorney General Davenport, who attended each site visit to monitor compliance with the protocol document. I would like to now recognize AAG Davenport for any additional comments he would like to make in establishing this record relevant to the site visits.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have much further to add other than to certify that, yes, all the protocols that were put in place in advance of the site visit were followed, that the commissioners, as you said, never attended, or no more than one commissioner attended a site visit at the time. The site visits were staggered, and that PDC was respectful of the process we put in place and did not use the site visits as an opportunity to either lobby or advocate for the permit applications.
Very good. Does any other commissioner desire to add into this disclosure? I think we've adequately covered it. Okay, now we will turn to Mr. Prashala and his panel.
Great. Well, hello again. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and commissioners. My name is Joe Prashala with Wellborn Sullivan McIntooley, and I'm here on behalf of the applicant PDC Energy. Here with me today are Vanessa Chase, the regulatory supervisor, Brian DeRose, surface land supervisor, Brian Cochier, manager of operations, compliance and policy, and then Tyler Sims, land advisor. As you know, PDC is a registered operator in good standing with the commission and has satisfied all financial assurance requirements of the state. PDC's application requests that the commission approve an oil and gas development plan, which we call the Kenosha OGDP, covering approximately 3,770 acres in Township 4 North, Range 64 West in Weld County. The OGDP includes 3 new oil and gas locations. As Mr. Maxey had identified them in his presentation there, the Drake pad. That pad will have 24 new horizontal wells, the Hen pad with 22 new horizontal wells, and the George pad with 23 new horizontal wells. Those 3 pads and the associated wells will develop 1 drilling and spacing unit that covers the approximate 3,770 acres, and that is for production of oil and gas and associated hydrocarbons from the Niobrara, Fort Hays, Codell, and Carlisle formations. PDC has secured more than 45% of the leasehold in the drilling and spacing unit and is an owner with the right to drill and produce in the application lands. These locations, the Drake, Hen, and George pads, are on fee surface in a very rural part of Weld County. At each location, however, there are RBUs within 2,000 feet.
I cannot hear the presenter anymore. Are other folks having issue or just me?
I was hearing him. Let's do a test, Mr. Prashala. Can you do testing 1, 2, 3?
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, where did I lose you, Commissioner McGowan?
About 20 seconds worth. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, let me back up. So perhaps at leasehold, PDC has 45% of the leasehold in the DSU. Great. So these locations, the Drake, Hen, and George, are on fee surface in rural Weld County. For each location, there are residential building units within 2,000 feet, and therefore alternative location analyses were performed as required by rule. As you will hear, and I think as Mr. Maxey indicated as well, that the alternative location analyses for these pads were very detailed and thorough, And they did evaluate many potential alternative locations for each. As you also heard from Mr. Maxey, and as you will further hear from PDC, PDC engaged in very robust community outreach regarding these pads and the development plans. I would like to note that for the Drake and the Hen pads, PDC seeks approval under Rule 604B4, seeking approval on a showing that the pads and the conditions of approval provide substantially equivalent protections for public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. But for the George pad, PDC is seeking approval under Rule 604B1 because all of the residential building unit owners that are within 2,000 feet provided informed consent. Weld County is the relevant local government, and as Mr. Maxey noted, the comprehensive development plan for these pads was approved at 1041 WOGLA 21-0007. There are no proximate local governments. PDC has not requested any variances or lesser impact exemptions, and all notice as required by Rule 303E and 504 was given. No petitions or interventions were received on this application. And then the director on May 27th, 2022, issued a very detailed and thorough director's recommendation, which we appreciate, and that recommends approval of the application. So with that, we would note that the application satisfies the Conservation Act and the Commission rules, and PDC respectfully requests that the commissioners adopt the director's recommendation and approve this application. Now I'll go ahead and turn this over to Ms. Vanessa Chase, who will give the presentation on the Kenosha OGDP, but I believe she may be having some video problems. So if it's acceptable to the commissioners, she will present via voice only, but we have the presentation up in any event.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Vanessa Chase, Regulatory Supervisor for PDC. My apologies for the camera issues. We couldn't get it working. But I wanted to start with highlighting a few key elements regarding PDC's commitment to the community. PDC employs over 500 Colorado employees and is immensely committed to the communities in which we live and work. For 2022, we have a $3 million budget for local charities, foundations, and scholarship programs. Additionally, employees are committed to giving back to the community and have a goal to provide over 4,000 hours of community service. PDC recently acquired Great Western Petroleum in early May. This acquisition increased PDC's acreage to 230,000 acres and allows for accelerated emission reduction targets. We will now move on to an overview of the Kenosha OGDP. PDC started working on the Kenosha Development Plan in January of 2019 and then proceeded with surface owner consultations. The SUAs were signed from August 2019 through January of 2020. Prior to the pre-app meeting held in March of 2021, PDC reviewed all 3 locations to ensure they fit within the scope of the mission change rulemaking. We held a community meeting for all owners within 2,000 feet in June of 2021 and subsequently submitted the OGDP in September 2021 with the Weld CDP submittal in December of 2021. The OGDP passed completeness in February 2022 and received a Weld County CDP approval and COGCC technical review comments in March of 2022. The OGDP direct recommendation of approval was obtained in May of 2022. The Kenosha OGDP is comprised of 3 surface locations. A total of 68.2 acres of disturbance during drilling and completion operations, resulting in a total of 31.2 acres of disturbance after interim reclamation. There are no high priority habitats, schools, childcare centers, designated outside activity areas, high occupancy building units, or disproportionately impacted communities for more than a mile. There will also be no impacts to surface water, floodplains, or wetlands. PDC is planning on a total of 69 wells to be drilled from 3 surface locations, which will incorporate one 3,770 acre drilling and spacing unit. PDC's current plans are to start construction on the Hen location in the first quarter of 2024, and then will immediately proceed to the Drake and George locations. The plan to execute these locations sequentially permit as one OGDP and one DSU, was determined as this is the last area of development for PDC's Kersey acreage. As you can see on the map shown on the right, the Kenosha development area is surrounded by existing horizontal wells, as well as the approved Noble Mustang CDP. I will now turn it over to Brian DeRose, who will provide an overview of PDC's robust ALA efforts and community outreach.
Thanks, Vanessa. Good afternoon. At PDC, community engagement is always at the forefront of our projects. Kenosha was no exception. As Vanessa mentioned, PDC began reaching out to owners in the Kenosha OGDP beginning in January 2019. First, we started out by talking with large parcel owners, residents, and homeowners along what we anticipated as haul routes. These initial consults allowed us to get a good feel for the area, community, and who might be willing to become a long-term partner with PDC. As the Kenosha project started to take form, alternate locations began to emerge, which were evaluated both internally and externally. Given the amount of information and data PDC had collected on the project for over 2 years, we decided to hold a community meeting on June 29, 2021. This included all surface owners with the location, local governments, ditch owners, and residential building units within 2,000 feet of the Drake and George locations. An additional neighborhood meeting was also conducted post-June 29th at the request of 3 residential building unit owners just over 1,000 feet from the working pad surface of the Drake location in Weld County to answer questions and strategize on the best access point as well as haul route. Overall, our engagement began in January 2019 to today. PDC has made over 190 contacts by the way of face-to-face meetings, community meetings, phone calls, text messages, email, and good old-fashioned mail. These touch points have led PDC to deliver 23 of the 28 informed consent letters, giving consent for all owners within 2,000 feet of 3 locations in the Kenosha OGDP, Drake, and George. Before I jump into each individual location, I'd like to take a moment to highlight PDC's ALA process specifically related to the Kenosha. PDC evaluated 30 sites for this project, which are all represented on a somewhat busy map you'll see on your screen. You'll also note on this slide are major touch points for reaching an adequate surface location that conforms to the best in public health, safety, welfare, environmental, and wildlife resources. At the onset, PDC first identified the area targeted for development, coupled with its ownership and surrounding surface development in the area. While it's not easy to see on this map, like Vanessa mentioned, Chevron's Mustang CDP borders PDC's Kenosha OGDP both to the east and south, with also the existing subsurface development west of PDC's Kenosha OGDP. This leaves PDC with an area consisting of 3,770 mineral acres. Our internal groups collaborated after identifying the area for development to aid in the process of determining well count, orientation of laterals, size of area needed for operations, equipment, and timelines for operations. Once these key identifiers were noted, PDC relied upon its early and often community engagement relationships to identify available and open surface locations that most of all minimize surrounding receptors with the least impacts to the community. PDC evaluated each of these locations for the Kenosha internally, in the field, and externally with nearby stakeholders. Once we were able to pick the 3 locations to develop the Kenosha OGDP that would minimize impacts to further distance to nearby receptors by the way of consolidation, like our HIN coupled with our Challenger location, locate wells within a pivot irrigated field like our George pad, and utilize an old turkey farm like our Drake, we began working out a surface use agreement for all 3 pads, which were successful in our pathway to a partnership with PDC. This slide is an aerial view of our Drake location that gives you a good feel for the lay of the land and a show of the old abandoned turkey barns that will be demolished, further reclaiming the area on the property. 10 alternative sites were evaluated for this third of the Kenosha OGDP, which boiled down to the Drake location, offering up a site consisting of 24 wells from a 22-acre pad, which will be reclaimed down to a 9.6 acres during the production phase. That's just outside of high priority habitat, outside of disproportionate impacted communities, floodplains, school facilities, and childcare facilities. PDC made 68 points of contact to residential building units within 2,000 feet of the Drake location that included a hand delivery of an informed consent packet like the one I'm holding up here. We received 6 of the 8 informed consent packets, with the remaining 2 electing not to designate consent or non-consent. You'll note on this slide, the green star represents RBUs that executed an informed consent packet, consent, blue diamond for RBU that are covered by our surface use agreement, and a red octagon as representation for RBUs that did not sign a packet at all. The 2 RBUs that did not sign had raised questions regarding the access point, all route, and timing of the traffic during operations. Through many contact points and the help of Weld County, PDC moved the proposed access point 300 feet north to align with Chevron's adjacent access to the west of County Road 51. Additionally, PDC has committed to limiting traffic during the hours of school pickup and drop-off during operations. This next photo is a bird's eye view of the HIN location, highlighting its rangeland characteristics. We also note PDC's Challenger pad in the production phase just off to the west, in which we're utilizing our operational abilities to co-locate the HIN location with an already producing Challenger pad. 9 alternative sites were evaluated for this third of the Kenosha OGDP that funneled down to the HIN location being co-located with a Challenger pad and offering up a site consisting of 22 wells from a 20.5 acre pad, which will be reclaimed down to 9.6 acres during the production phase. That's outside of high priority habitat, outside of any disproportionate impacted communities, floodplain, school facilities, and child care facilities. Like Drake, PDC made 101 points of contact to residential building units within 2,000 feet of the HIN location, which yielded 11 informed consent packets informing consent out of the 14 delivered to the residential building unit stakeholders. On this slide, the green star represents RBUs that executed an informed consent packet as consent. Blue diamond for the surface owner RBU that is covered by our surface use agreement, and the red octagon as representation for the RBU that executed an informed consent packet, but electing not to consent. And last but not least is the yellow star that establishes 3 parties, 50-50 property ownership, husband and wife, one owner electing to consent, one owner electing not to consent, and a daughter as the tenant electing to not consent. From the feedback from RBU 3 that designated not consent was that he didn't feel like he knew enough about the subsurface portion of the project and how it may or may not impact a surface. PDC subsequently offered expert to visit with him, but he declined to offer. RBU 4 noted a long history with her and her owner, which the HIN pad is located. Owner 1 and tenant were quite apprehensive about providing consent. Among those items noted were dust and noise. PDC subsequently communicated that the entirety of the location would be wrapped in temporary 32-foot sound walls in an effort to minimize, if not avoid, fugitive lighting and noise. Additionally, PDC provided comment that the access road will be addressed with dust suppressant application to minimize dust during operations. On your screen, you'll see what is a gray aerial view of the proposed George location, establishing how the facility will be tucked outside of the pivot and south, where the wells will be located right inside the pivot irrigated field. 11 alternative sites were evaluated for this third of the Kenosha OGDP that narrowed into the George location being situated just inside the pivot irrigated field, maximum distance to nearby receptors, with 23 wells from a 24.9 acre pad, which will reclaim down to 12 acres during the production phase. That's outside of high priority habitat, outside of any disproportionate impacted communities, floodplain, school facilities, and child care facilities. Similar to both the Drake and HIN, PDC made 27 points of contact at the George location, resulting in positive response that yielded 6 of the 6 informed consent received back to PDC as all consent for residential building units within 2,000 feet. That concludes my portion. I'll now turn it over to Brian Coshier to touch on the cumulative impacts.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, commissioners, director, and staff for the tireless work on this application. I will outline a few key points to highlight the best management practices PDC will utilize to minimize potential impacts relating to the Kenosha development. Over the past year, PDC has had collaborative meetings with the CDPHE, COGCC, APCD,
and a WQCD outlining best management practices on a high level. Through these meetings, we discuss facility design, emission controls and reductions, air monitoring, stormwater management, and many other procedures to avoid or reduce potential for impacts. When we met in March to discuss the Kenosha OGDP specifically, we were aligned in many ways with the CDPHE recommendation. PDC currently uses and has committed to, for future permit applications, a Group 3 base fluid for its drilling mud. This base fluid is a highly refined mineral oil that effectively eliminates the odor. Another topic of our conversations was produced water takeaway. The closest water pipeline infrastructure from Kenosha is over 15 miles away as the crow flies. There are many complexities to tying this development into that infrastructure. As Vanessa pointed out, this is the final piece of development in PDC's Kersey area, which means there will be no future development that can tie into this expansion. In addition, it would require a minimum disturbance of 55 acres to bring the infrastructure to the locations within the Kenosha. Each pad will require roughly 5 round trips per day after year 1 and 3 after year 2 for water hauling. Due to these projections and the area in which the pads were located, it was determined the impacts may be greater to pipe water. Therefore, water takeaway was not a recommendation from the CDPHE on the Kenosha OGDP. However, an advantage of having existing facilities in the area is many of these are electrified. PDC's initial submittal was to have all drilling and facilities electrified, and we are committed to execute this at the time of development. The biggest change to come out of our CDPHE consultation was regarding our facility design, particularly the tanks. PDC's initial application had temporary oil tanks in place for the first year of production at each facility. Over the time since submittal, we have learned and adapted to design and implement ways to be more protective. For this, in our formal CDPHE consultation for the Kenosha, PDC agreed to amend the application for Kenosha and future submittals to reflect a tankless hydrocarbon storage facility. These changes have been made, which is reflected in the application before you. As far as potential impacts from noise and light, PDC has done thorough evaluations and modeling for both. We are able to install mitigations based on the modeling that greatly minimize any potential impacts. And for lighting impacts during production phase, PDC completely avoids these by having no permanent lights installed at our facilities. I will now pass it back to Vanessa to conclude our presentation.
PDC's tankless design significantly reduces the potential for spills and leaks during the production phase. It is PDC's intent to keep chemical storage, refueling, and staging more than 500 feet from any ordinary high water mark. However, out of an abundance of caution and to ensure the utmost protection, PDC discussed the George and Drake locations with CPW and obtained waivers. Through the Weld County requirements, all 3 locations went through a rigorous engineered drainage design. For the Drake location, the drainage plan is designed for detention. This plan will control, detain, and filter any stormwater on site prior to discharge. During the production phase, this design can detain 52,000 cubic feet of stormwater. For insight, an Olympic-sized swimming pool holds 88,000 cubic feet of water, meaning this location will detain more than half the volume of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. The Hin location is also engineered for detention and again is designed to detain more than half the volume of an Olympic-sized swimming pool during the production phase. There are no ordinary high water marks or surface waters located within 500 feet of this location. The George location was engineered for retention due to the location of the Gilmore ditch. This means all stormwater will be retained on the location and will not discharge. The designed retention area for the production phase can hold 172,000 cubic feet of stormwater, or the volume of about 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. This volume is almost doubled prior to interim reclamation. Air monitoring will be conducted in accordance with AQCC's regulations in an effort to detect, evaluate, and reduce emissions. Monitoring will be conducted as a baseline and then continuously through drilling, completions, and the first 6 months of production. PDC's locations are equipped with 24/7 remote monitoring and state-of-the-art cameras to detect leaks, smoke, and fires. Additionally, automation towers are installed to provide remote shut-in capabilities, and guard shacks are on site during drilling and completion operations for site security. Throughout the Kenosha OGDP, PDC has highlighted vigorous operational protections that will be in place to ensure avoidance, minimization, and mitigation of adverse impacts to public health, safety, and welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. These practices include, but are not limited to, a tankless facility, oil and gas takeaway, electric-powered drilling rig and production equipment, a quiet frac fleet, sound walls, and daily inspections at production facilities. PDC would like to extend its appreciation to the staff, director, and commissioners for all the hard work on the Kenosha OGDP. We are confident that these 3 locations are the most protective, along with our robust best management practices PDC is committed to. Thank you very much, and we anticipate any questions that you might have regarding this OGDP.
Thank you to the team. We now have an opportunity for commissioners that may have questions for the team. So commissioners, who wants to lead off with questions? Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I only have one question because I can't remember and I can't find it in my notes. I apologize. In the past, when operators have committed to plugging wells as they develop acreage, I've asked if they've been willing to work with CDPHE to come up with an estimated emission savings so that we can track that in our cumulative impacts report. And I don't know if I saw that as part of the application. I'm wondering if you all are willing to do that so we can keep track.
Thank you, Commissioner Gowan, for the question. We do have 102 wells identified that will be plugged based on this, that have the opportunity to be plugged based on this development. Those wells are all of Noble's or Chevron's wells, and we have a very good working relationship with them as we have a lot of intertwined acreage. We've already discussed this subset of wells with Noble, and have a very strong feeling that most of these, or the majority or all of them, will be plugged. Now, working with the CDPHE, since these are not our wells, and the emissions associated with these wells are part of the inventory with Noble, I don't know how that would work mechanically, since we don't submit permits on these wells and we don't report the emissions on them.
Perhaps Noble would be willing just to submit estimated emission savings directly to COGCC. I'm just trying to figure out how we keep track of all this so that we're doing our due diligence with cumulative impacts. So I'm not quite sure how to work that out, but if there's any way that we can, that would be great.
I can follow up with Noble on a future conversation related to this topic, but we had one this past, I think it was in March or so, with many disciplines in Noble, really discussing our plans related to this development and other developments on wells that are offset to these developments, but what the intentions and plans are for them. So I will follow up with that meeting.
Thanks.
Other commissioners with questions? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation on the application. I've got a few different questions. I think first, just generally, having had an opportunity to go on the site visit, see the proposed locations for this particular application, and through that also seeing other operators' sites in the area, as well as I think an additional PDC site. And understanding that you had conversations with CDPHE around produced water takeaway, but I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about kind of anticipated infrastructure necessary in order to be able to do produced water takeaway comprehensively in this area where there is significant activity going on. It seems like we're able to, develop takeaway for oil and gas and handle the impacts associated with that, but produced water continues to lag behind the infrastructure for oil and gas takeaway. So I wanted to just chat a little bit about that.
Thanks, Commissioner Messner, and I think I can chime in here. Part of our process with development is really working with our midstream partners from a very early stage, even before, permitting with the COGCC. We're forecasting volumes, not just for a development, but over the field-wide holistic view. Now, as Vanessa pointed out, this is our last really development area in Kersey, which has been an historic, focus of PDC to develop. So a lot of these historical wells are, 4 or 5 years old, smaller pads, 1 mile laterals, kind of how we used to develop in the late teens. Now with that, there's a couple things that we're fortunate for in this field is that, we bring 3 fluid streams to surface, but unlike West Texas, where there's just a ton of water with the oil, we actually produce very little water. And we get the majority of our water back near term, and then it tapers, pretty significantly, within year 1. I think I outlined the truck trips to our 3 locations within the testimony. So, when I said that the current infrastructure right now is 15 miles away, as a crow flies, we're probably looking at anywhere from 20 to 25 miles, when you start talking right away and getting pipe in the ground. Now there's a couple constraints that we believe are could be challenging. One is the resources. In working with our midstream partners, they have a portfolio of projects that are kind of in the queue, and based on the what the impacts of the project are is kind of how they can prioritize. Now, our midstream contracts are really based on dollar per volume through pipe. And since there's not much volume going through the pipe, it's a tough project to bring forth. Now, the resource I'm talking about isn't necessarily capital. I mean, that's always part of the conversation, but really the resource is supply chain and personnel to execute these projects. It just becomes, when you're trying to run a 20-25 mile pipeline to really an island development, where it doesn't even make sense to tie in some of these older locations, because a lot of these are, a truckload every 3 days, after the decline, it becomes tough in the resource. But then also the impacts, looking at cumulatively what we're talking about. And, I said 55 acres would be a 15-mile disturbance for a 30-foot right of way. Now, if we're talking 2025, we're really in between the 55 to 90 range of disturbance area. But then if you really look at the impacts associated with, what goes into that pipe, the emissions associated with making 25 miles of pipe, the emissions associated with, the heavy equipment installing that pipeline, over that distance, it just became, and that was part of the conversation. It just became evident that we believe the impacts to be greater to bring the pipe to these developments as opposed to truck, knowing that, our truckloads decreased greatly. And, I think by year 2, we're at average of three round trips per day to each location. I know that was long-winded, but I hope I answered your question.
I appreciate that. That gives me your perspective on some of the decision-making around this. It does seem like the infrastructure necessary for produced water will continue to be an issue moving forward, and so it will continue to be questions that I ask, and we'll consider in these applications. Now, understanding that there is no produced water takeaway and there's going to be on-site storage of produced water. I was a little confused, I think, about some of the comments in the application. Give me just a second to get to my notes. I think at one point, it states that, all gas captured from tanks is going to be, compressed and piped. I think at another point, it indicates that emissions from tanks would be routed to an emissions control device to be combusted. I'm just trying to understand what you're proposing for emissions that are coming from the produced water tanks.
And we have Meredith Knopf on, if we can bring her up as a panelist, because she can speak to, Reg 7 and the requirements that we are held to for emissions.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Messner. That's a very good question. Most of the gases in those produced water tanks would be considered flash gases, which would be a result of the produced water dumping into those tanks. So not the gas that we would send down the pipe. And in this case, we under Reg 7 Part D, we have to control all tanks that have uncontrolled emissions of VOCs at 2 tons per year. And in a conservative measure, we control all our produced water tanks to meet that rule, even though we drop pretty quickly under that uncontrolled 2 tons per year for produced water via the decline that Brian mentioned previously.
Thanks for that. And so I guess one of the questions that I'll have, and I'll ask this to staff as well, but as I read our rule 903 clearly indicates that there should not be flaring or venting of gas. There's certainly Reg 7, and I understand that's a separate agency that's managing that particular regulation, but I didn't see anything in the application that addressed Rule 903 and either a gas capture plan or intent to utilize a Form 4, sundry, or a variance in order to be able to address that proposed or anticipated combustion associated with the produced water tanks. So I had 2 questions. One is, does staff believe that that is necessary? And 2, was wondering what applicants' thoughts were on that.
I think I can address the gas capture plan. So within the gas capture plan, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's at 904. The requirement is to submit a gas capture plan unless you commit to have oil and gas midstream takeaway at the time of first production. So we have committed to that, and so that the gas capture plan isn't required. But I believe there's subpoints 5 through 9 that says if you commit to this and don't submit a gas capture plan, please put the BMPs, or how you're going to address the BMPs in 904, 5 through 9 into the cumulative impacts plan. So we didn't just not do it. We committed to the takeaway and then have those BMPs incorporated into that cumulative impacts plan, not the 2B.
I appreciate that. I think I'm talking more about the Rule 903, which is the venting and flaring of natural gas, that indicates that both during drilling operations, completions, and production, as I read the rule, it clearly indicates that it either needs to be, captured and piped, or there needs to be gas capture plan or sundry or variance associated with that. And so I do need some clarification on that. Because
So
I think it's an important point for me to be able to say that whatever the application states meets our rules as written.
Yeah, and I'll take a stab at it first, and Meredith, please chime in. Going back to the rulemakings of, I guess, they're 2020 now, in working through 903, really the big thing is ordinary flaring and venting, but then there's also this secondary capture or tertiary capture through lower pressure devices. And the way we interpret that is, we're separating our fluid stream at initial separation. We send our gas to a 2-phase separator that then has a VRU that sucks that gas off, compresses it, puts it down the line. And then we send our oil to a surge vessel. Same thing, has a VRU that can compress it and go down the line. And anything that is going to flare or to the enclosed combustion devices is really a tertiary separation that is combusted at a 98% efficiency. And the way I remember 903 and looking back at it and jogging my memory, the low pressure separation devices were excluded from typical flaring and venting.
Which is as a staff, their thoughts on this, Commissioner Messner?
Yeah, that was my next question. I would appreciate that.
I see Mr. Andrews has appeared on the panel. Doug, you're muted. Do you want to unmute and potentially weigh in?
I apologize for that. Thank you for the question, Commissioner Messner. Would you mind repeating your question for me?
Well, the question is that the applicant is proposing to utilize, you know, a 98, acknowledging that it's a 98% efficient combustion to deal with associated gas after the process that Mr. Co-Chair just explained, but to combust it, as there is no takeaway associated with this. I read Rule 903 to indicate that that would require a gas capture plan, Form 4 or variance to require that, or would require that. And my question to staff is, what is your interpretation of that, or how did you look at this?
Thank you, Commissioner Messner, for repeating the question. Yeah, staff did look at Rule 903, specifically Rule 903D, where it states after the commencement of production operations, venting or flaring of natural gas produced from completed wells is prohibited, except under the following circumstances. And we also looked at our statement of basis and purpose for these rules, where it talks about venting. And there is a statement in the statement of purpose, basis and purpose that says the commission does not intend for its definition of venting to include the gas entrained in the hydrocarbon liquids that is released or flashed as liquids are sent from separation equipment to a tank. So but then that again, the statement of basis and purpose also goes on and kind of gives some other qualifiers about, you know, that type of gas. So it's, to staff, it's not, at this time, it's not 100% clear. We do expect PDC to be in compliance with Rule 903, and that prior to, you know, their production, we would probably need to revisit this issue with them and, you know, determine whether a gas capture plan would need to be submitted in, or possibly a variance via a Form 4 sundry.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Andrews. I appreciate your perspective. All right, so moving on from that, I wonder, and this is kind of a big broad question. Oh, well, let me ask a specific question first. So my understanding in the application, and I think from the presentation as well, is that even though CPW recommended approval of a waiver 500 feet from the high water mark for chemical storage, PDC is proposing to not store chemicals inside of the 500-foot high water mark. Is that correct? Correct.
Yes, this is Zach Wiesenfeld, EHS with PDC. And out of abundance of caution, we obtained those waivers after consult with the CPW, but it is our intent to keep chemical storage 500 feet away from these areas. But that waiver is intact just in case we do need it, but we intend to keep those 500 feet or greater away.
So I appreciate that. I guess I was looking for either a yes or a no, like you are going to keep it 500 feet away or you're not. So can you be more solid with that answer?
It's our intent to keep it away. That's why we obtained the waivers. I believe we'll try. Unfortunately, I can't give a yes or no answer at this time because I'm not layouts for drilling and completions. I will say it is our intent to keep it 500 feet away or greater.
Okay. So last question is, and this is around air monitoring. And kind of generally, you know, I wonder if you could just explain to me how, like holistically, the different aspects that you're proposing to handle emissions associated with this particular operation is going to be substantially equivalent or protective of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources.
Sure, and I can take that one. Thank you, Commissioner Messner. It's a very good question. PDC has really employed a multi-step approach in monitoring our air emissions. First and foremost, we have air monitors, and the number of air monitors we place around the perimeter of the facility varies in size. So the minimum we place is 4. We can place up to as many as we need to feel that we're correctly addressing and protecting our nearby residents. And so we measure that, and we have that from at least around 10 to 30 days prior to our big rig arriving at our facility. And we keep those monitors on all the way through the first 6 months of production. So those air monitors are monitoring for TVOCs. They're actually being monitored continuously at 1 second intervals and then averaged up to 1 minute. We also have benzene sorbent tubes that continuously monitor benzene over a 14-day period. So we have that step as well. We are alerted anytime we reach a trigger level, but we've also, that has been approved by the CDPHE. We also have our own internal trigger levels. So we go out and actually, anytime we see anything, any spike really above non-detect, we go out and look, regardless if it triggers that threshold or not. So we're constantly monitoring our operations on a basically minute by minute basis using those air monitors. Additionally, we also have our LDAR program that we start, and these facilities will all be monitored monthly using our FLIR cameras. Third, we also have installed, cameras that are fixed cameras on our facilities too, and they're able to capture anywhere between, some sort of emissions, our levels in our tanks, and also any kind of spills. So we're able to react very quickly. We also have our 24-hour field monitoring room that can also react very quickly to anything we see. So we feel like this is a pretty comprehensive plan at this point in order to be protective of our neighbors.
Thank you for that answer. I appreciate that. I think at this point, I don't have any further questions.
Other commissioners with questions? Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the presentation today. So we've had other applicants come before us asking for 604B4, not really a waiver, but an application of that rule to their operations. And they've talked to us a little bit about their historical analysis from their own monitoring of their operations, and kind of the distance and concentration impact might be the right word, but kind of where they're seeing it. And I'm curious if PDC has done the same thing and what the results are, if you have any kind of accumulation of that data, and how it influences your application today, and just in general, what that looks like for PDC's operations similar to what's before us.
Sure, I can also answer that. Thank you for that question, Commissioner Gonzalez. It's something we have been looking at. We have approximately 12 monitoring locations going on as we speak at 12 of our facilities. They're newer facilities we've been actively monitoring for over a year. And thus far, we have only exceeded our trigger threshold at 1 location, and that was a result of a large spill. And that was caught very quickly. The trigger threshold was also only for exactly that 3-hour rolling average, and then it dropped immediately below. So we were able to correlate that trigger event with something that was an upset condition or unusual, and we were able to basically eliminate that issue very quickly. All the other small spikes we've seen have been related to maintenance activities, or potentially sometimes during completions, but we don't see anything that ever happens at a consistent basis that exceeds any threshold that would be viewed as harmful to human health and the environment per the HGV guidelines.
Thank you, Ms. Knopf. And I don't know if I caught this. I don't know if it was said, but at what distance are the monitors placed for the 12 monitors you're referencing?
The monitors are placed depending on what is happening at the facility. We do move them in closer to the facility, but for the sound walls, we have to have them a little bit set back from the sound wall. So we're not getting that, basically that kind of overdraft where the emissions or the air flies up over the sound walls and then misses our monitors. So they're placed at a distance about 3 times the height of the sound walls. And then once we have a production facility, we do move those in closer. So we're closer to the boundary. And we do set them up strategically based on surface owner agreements, and then also where our risk is with our residential building units. So they are strategically placed and approved by CDPHE. And that's why we don't want to limit ourselves to just 4 monitors. Some of our pads are larger, so we have had up to 6 or 7 monitors placed to be protective.
So during completion and drilling operations, when you have your sound walls up, and those are 35-foot sound walls, do I have that correct? I see Brian shaking his head.
32.
32. Okay, cool. We'll round up to 35. We'll call it 100 feet at the 3x, right, at that distance that you're trying to place those. So what you're telling me, I guess, is that at 100 feet for these 12 monitors that you guys are running, that you've only seen one spike that was, I guess, of great concern, and that was related to a spill or a release, and then you've had a handful of kind of I guess blip spikes. I'm using colloquial language here. I apologize, but I want to make sure I'm capturing the situation as best I can.
Correct. And actually, when we had that issue where we had a threshold exceedance, we were actually in production. So the monitors were a little bit closer. The sound walls were gone at that point. So this was a spike that was much closer to the location of the currently operating pad. Everything else has been very small. And when I say we really do take everything seriously and want to investigate it, because we're trying to, understand our own operations on where we see these, I guess you'd say blips. So they could be 1 second blips, 1 minute blips, and we're still going out and making sure that these are normal operations and we're not seeing anything that could be indicative of something larger.
Thank you.
Just to clarify, we have 12 locations with 4+ monitors, not just 12 monitors in the field. So we have a pretty good data set.
Correct. Yes.
Thank you for that clarification.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I just have one more question. There was a recommendation from CDPHE that was not supported by staff, not around something called rod packing, and I'm not exactly sure what that is or what the consideration was, but there wasn't a lot of further discussion around that, in any of the application materials that I saw, and so I wonder if someone could just address that.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. We asked for further clarification of what exactly they were looking for with that BMP. So we haven't received it yet, but we promise to continue to work towards understanding what the ask is. So that's why it wasn't included as a BMP for this application. Is we're just kind of in the exploration stage of what is being asked.
Okay. Yeah, it wasn't clear to me, and what it was or what the expectation was, and so I appreciate that. That was the only other question I had.
Other folks with questions? All right. Seeing no questions, I think it's time for the commission to engage in deliberations, and I'll go first. I guess I want to applaud PDC for the good work that went into this application. And for allowing the commissioners, some of us, to come out and view the locations. This is a large amount of acreage, and having gone through the application, having looked at the alternative locations that were analyzed, having looked at the breadth and depth of the review, I also want to call out Doug Andrews for his superior work at the commission in the review of this. It's easy to see there's been a heavy lift here, but I think that this application is indicative of how an operator can use the rules and regulations that have been developed in a protective manner and to allow for the production of oil and gas in our state in a manner that's consistent with 181 and in a manner that is consistent with what we were shooting for when we developed the regulations. And this is almost kind of a small comprehensive area plan. I mean, if you kind of want to think about it that way. And I'm excited to see comprehensive area plans come through. I note that Weld County approved this as a comprehensive drilling plan, which is another way of thinking about a comprehensive area plan. And I applaud Weld County for the good work they did. I think that their early on work with our staff, with PDC, doing the alternative location analysis has really developed up a well thought out application for the development of a lot of mineral acreage, and doing so in a manner that is protective. I also want to call out PDC for the really great work that you've done in your reach outs to the community. The sheer number of reach outs, the intensity of it, the various ways of doing it. I mean, I think it's the proof is in the pudding in terms of the volume of informed consents that you have here. And I have had an opportunity to listen, not about this application, but to various operators about what they do with regard to their informed consent reach outs. And I think you're doing a good job. And I think we see it here in the application with this, the sheer number of informed consents that you obtain. And so, I think that just looking through my notes, I think those are sort of the highlights of the things that I saw here. And I am going to be a firm yes vote. I think you've done a good job. Staff's done a good job, and I think this application is reflective of how development can and should occur in the state of Colorado. Others desiring to deliberate. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'm also in support of this application. I think that it's well designed, it's well laid out, it's well thought out. The presentation, the application were thorough. For me, I think the outreach is huge, right? Specifically when we're talking about 604B4 or any 604B, any one of those is important, right? And I really appreciate all the work that went into that. And I think that's reflected in getting 24 out of 29 informed consents. That to me does not seem like a very easy hurdle to achieve. Informed consent is a pretty challenging agreement to obtain, even with substantial outreach, even with education and engagement and answering questions. You're still going to have folks who are in support, but aren't going to sign your informed consent. So I think that's it should be applauded, the level of informed consent that you achieved. And of course, we'd love to see applications come in with 100% informed consent and don't even put us through 604B4, right? We don't even have to make that substantially equivalent determination. But when we do, I think it's important that we have the all the information that's being provided in terms of the alternative location analysis, in terms of the comprehensive nature of the planning, the total engagement beyond that. And so I think this is a good application. I appreciate the work that the operator and the work that staff especially has put into this application before it's come here. And so again, I'm in support of this application.
That actually leads me to another comment. Commissioner Gonzalez, thank you for those. I wanted to, I don't know where Commissioner Messner's coming down on this, but he asked a bunch of questions about pipeline and water takeaway. And Mr. Kosher, I wanted to acknowledge, I think that not putting in how many ever miles of pipeline for the development that you've now admitted is sort of the last of the area, the Kersey area development, that's reasonable to me. And so in particular, when you add to it the fact that at the beginning, there's going to be 5 round trip trucks, and within a year or two, it's going to go down to 2, and I anticipate it would go down even further. So I understand that. I think that is a reasonable approach. I think it's less harmful, frankly. And so that's point one. And point two, I appreciate your talking with CDPHE and consulting with them and bringing into the application BMPs where it was appropriate. I again appreciate Mr. Andrews' work on reviewing that and sort of piping in as well about, well, that one's not necessarily as appropriate. So I think you have landed in a pretty good spot with the CDPHE concept. So a couple of other thoughts for my fellow commissioners. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I do think that this application was a well-done application. I think that the amount of information that was provided was right. The depth of the information was right. The level of consultation with local governments, with CDPHE, with CPW, with COGCC staff, and with the area residents was strong. I think that, and I've said it before, I think the informed consent goes a really long way with me, and the level of informed consent in this particular situation was big. I do note that it appears that some of the folks that maybe did not sign informed consent were concerned about truck traffic and dust. And so, you know, this is the reason that I bring up produced water takeaway and looking at this stuff comprehensively. And I acknowledge that the produced water infrastructure is not there, right? It's not there. It's 15 miles away, perhaps a midstream issue. But I think holistically, you know, throughout the DJ Basin, there's a lack of produced water takeaways and infrastructure. And so I think this ends up being a really big thing. And I'm not hanging it on this application, but it's a point I think needs to be brought up. Although I do acknowledge the analysis that Mr. Kochier did in determining, you know, how to apply that to this particular application and looking at holistic impacts associated with that. But over the lifetime of wells, it's that truck traffic that potentially causes some of the biggest complaints, right? And so I just think it's something that needs to be considered and addressed holistically throughout the DJ. And so that's kind of where I was coming from with that point, is trying to understand, you know, the overall analysis of that. I do think that a literal interpretation of the rule 903, you know, does indicate some analysis needs to go on around a gas capture plan. Should there be, you know, more than, you know, a little bit of flash gas that's associated with the produced water tanks. And so I think that's something that could be just acknowledged and addressed, depending on operations that happen on the ground and what's occurring there. You know, I think PDC is a good operator and knows that if they're seeing unusual amounts of gas that is not able to be compressed and piped, that's going to require some either a gas capture plan or a Form 4. And I appreciate the explanation of the House, you know, around how we're going to minimize impacts to public health, the environment, wildlife resources, around emissions associated with this, and the close consultation with CDPHE on this particular application. And so I also will be in support of this particular application.
Further deliberation, Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And there's not much left to say after my fellow commissioners. I agree with everything that's been said. I was appreciative of the operator looking at the bus stop situation and solving that problem. I think that it's important. I was also very appreciative to be able to go out and see these sites and how they kind of interconnect and why they've been grouped together for this OGDP. I think it was well done to put that together. And I agree with Commissioner Messner that, you know, in these OGDPs where we're going to see a lot of activity, it would be nice to see produced water being piped. But I also understand, like, if this is the end of the line and the end of development in this area for an operator, I'm not sure that actually makes much sense. versus starting fresh in some area and knowing that you're going to be doing some continual development that keeps building on itself. That might be a different discussion for the commission. But I was appreciative of all the work that went into it, and appreciative of Mr. Andrews also coming along and answering some of my questions when we were on site. So
Further deliberations? Seeing none, do we have a motion?
Motion to approve PDC's Kenosha OGDP application.
Second.
Motion and a second. Is there further discussion? We've been doing a lot of discussing, so maybe not. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much, PDC.
Thank you, commissioners.
Commissioners, it is 2:06. We have one matter left on our agenda. Why don't we take a 10-minute break and return at 2:16? All right, welcome back, commissioners. It is 2:16. We are back on the record. We have one final docket number, 211-000-205, Wellington Operator Company, LLC, requesting a variance. Let's see, Wellington Operator request a variance and 12-month extension up to and including the last day of the 12th month for the application wells from Rule 2097, Rule 419, and Order 1-232, requirement to have and monitor Bradenhead valves on all wells and to file annual reports of Bradenhead test. Mouthful. It looks like we have a presentation from the operator to start, and then an opportunity for commissioner question. Good afternoon.
Thank you very much. I just want to make sure. Let's see. Do we have Tom Shaw on here?
Mr. Shaw is a participant. We can elevate him.
Okay, we do need to elevate him, please. Thank you.
We've asked Mr. Shaw to join as a panelist.
Okay. Sorry, Tom. Tom is doing most of the talking, so I just want to make sure he is actually on. There we go. Okay. All right, I am going to share my screen. Can everybody see my screen? Oh, not yet. Okay, great. Thank you very much, commissioners, for your time this afternoon. As you mentioned, Wellington Operating Company is requesting a Bradenhead variance application. We are requesting an application. We're requesting a variance to allow Wellington Operating Company to bring certain wells into compliance. They are old wells and do not have Bradenhead valves at the moment. Okay. So this request is for a 12-month variance and extension of the requirements set forth in Rule 209C and Rule 419 and in Order 1-232 to have and monitor Bradenhead valves on all of the wells and to file annual reports of the Bradenhead tests. Rule 209C allows the commission to approve specific fields or portions of fields as Bradenhead test areas. Rule 419 creates a process for operator-performed Bradenhead monitoring, testing, and reporting. And Order 1-232 creates a Bradenhead monitoring area in Larimer County and requires operators to have and monitor Bradenhead valves on all wells within the monitoring area, as well as to annually file results of those Bradenhead tests with the commission. The request is being asked to allow Wellington to safely bring these application wells into compliance with the valve and monitoring requirements where Wellington can technically do so. So Since filing the variance and the extension request, Wellington has installed braided head valves on 2 of the wells. There were 6 application wells. There are now 4 remaining to be retrofitted. And Wellington is requesting this extension through December 2022. We do believe that this application satisfies the COGCC rule requirements. All interested parties were properly noticed and there were no petitions filed. Larimer County did file a letter, but it was not a petition. It was not a protest. Further on, in April 2022, COGCC staff recommended approval of this request. Finally, we do believe that granting this application will not violate the basic intent of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Act because it will not adversely impact public health, safety, welfare, the environment, or wildlife resources. Granting this application will allow Wellington to safely and methodically bring the application wells into compliance. Today we have Tom Shaw, who is the geotechnical manager with Wellington Operating Company, who will be speaking through the history of the field and the existing wells at issues. And he'll also talk through his experience or the company's experience in retrofitting the wells with the braided head valve. Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your time this afternoon. The background of the field is shown on this slide. The original field was discovered in 1923. The bulk of the wells that were drilled in the field were in place by 1927. There was a warehouse fire in 1948 that destroyed a lot of the early records as to the construction of facilities in the field as well as well configurations. The unit was formed in 1976 with the expectations of advancing enhanced oil recovery. Wellington operating, the current company operating the field, became operator in 1992. It sought to retrofit wells for the braided head valves in 2019 and was unable to do so on 10 of the wells, primarily due to concerns about excavation risk. So consequently, it filed an administrative variance on those 10 wells in October of 2020. King Operating, the current equity controlling interest in the company, acquired the controlling interest in March 2021 and initiated a program to retrofit the 10 wells with braided head valves. Of those original 10 wells, 6 have been successfully retrofitted, and we're down to the final 4 wells. And hence, we're seeking the extension of time to the end of the year to be able to make a final determination on those wells. Just for reference, this is the central part of the field, Fowl Canyon Road, just west of the interstate in Larimer County. And the north end of the field are the 14-1, 14-2, and 13-1, which were lacking braided head valves. In the south end of the field, the 20-3, the 26-1, and the 32-2 were missing braided head valves at the time when we filed for the variance. Subsequently, we've retrofitted the 26-1 and the 32-2. We've started operations on the 14-1. The next slide, please. This is the general procedure for retrofitting. We have to disconnect and remove the pumping unit. In the photograph, you can see the foot of the pumping unit off in the upper right-hand corner, marked with a safety cone. We clear and level the area around the wellhead, excavate the first 2 to 4 feet by hand with shovels to make sure that we have located the wellheads, any piping, flow lines accurately, and then use a backhoe to excavate to the bottom of the conductor pipe, which is usually 10 to 12 feet down, but has been as much as 17 feet. Shore up the sides of the excavation as needed for worker safety. Clear off the conductor pipe and inspect, remove any loose soil, make sure that we understand the condition of the pipe. We basically will excavate until we find an annulus penetrating port or valve stem that allows us to install the braided head valve. which we'll undo, then attach piping that will set the gauge at surface to comply with the regulation. Then backfill the excavation, tamping down and compressing the soil as needed, clean up the location, reinstall the pumping unit, and return the wells to production. Typically, this procedure has been taking between 2 to 5 days. It's something we do very carefully. Next slide, please. It's a very low risk activity from an environmental perspective. The Money Sandstone, which is the producing reservoir, is very pressure depleted. Bottom hole pressure at 4,500 feet is generally less than 3,000 pounds. All but one well in the field is on active well pump. The wells will not flow to surface. Shut-in fluid levels are almost 2,500 feet below any aquifer. Our casing pressures throughout the field are between 0 and 4 pounds. There's almost no pressure at surface coming off these wells. The primary risk is around excavation stability and making sure that we can get people in and out of the hole in a safe and efficient fashion. Next slide, please. This is the primary reason the variance is needed. These are older wells coming up almost 100 years. They're generally varying complexity. No two wells have proven to have the same configuration. Below ground, the configuration really isn't well known in most cases. So we have to excavate slowly and prudently to make sure that we don't create a hazard. These are deeper excavations, so they have to, in some cases, be shored up along the sides per OSHA regulations. We have tight locations due to agricultural encroachment over time. In this example, we've got planted crops to within 15 feet of the wellhead. So we try to avoid, and the access roads to the location are shared use with our agricultural surface owners. So we don't want to interrupt their operations. As I mentioned, we've got 4 wells remaining, the 13-1, 14-2, 14-1, and the 20-3. The 13-1 and 20-3 are temporarily abandoned and do not have wellheads. We've got an ongoing engineering review as to their utility, but the general expectation is that we will likely abandon those wells rather than retrofit them. Next, please. But these are the remaining 4 locations. The 20-3 is in the upper left-hand corner. It's within an irrigation pivot. The access road to the location has been planted over for this growing season. Same circumstance for the 13-1. It's also within the irrigation pivot, and the access to the location has been planted over. The 14-1 is within our northern tank battery. And so it's a little complicated in terms of equipment and managing the continuing operations of being able to let out crude oil. And then finally, the 14-2 is just a tight location with planted crops. And so rather than disrupt our surface owners' operations, we prefer to do the 20-3, the 13-1 in the 14-2 outside of growing season, which would be after October of this year. Next, please. So Teresa, I'll hand it back to you.
Sorry, you handed it back right after I had muted myself. Yeah, just concluding remarks. This variance and extension are necessary in order to allow Wellington to safely bring the remaining application wells into compliance with the Braden Head valve and monitoring requirements, while minimizing impact to the surface and to landowners' use and enjoyment thereof. As you saw, we have somewhat complicated sites, and Wellington needs time to safely get in there, work with the landowner on timing, and do what it needs to do to bring these wells into compliance. Additionally, these wells, we just need the additional 6 months as Wellington hopes to be able to get in there, determine whether the wells can be retrofitted, and if not, they will be abandoned within 6 months of making that determination per the COGCC regulations. Further, we do believe that granting this variance and extension will not result in any adverse impact to public health, safety, welfare, the environment, or the wildlife resources as explained in Tom's testimony, and COGCC staff does recommend approval of this variance request. I'd like to open it up to any questions.
Commissioners, questions? Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And now that you've testified, thank you for testifying. I was having trouble understanding if you were asking for a full 12 months to make this happen, or it would have happened by the end of this year, December 2022. So I think what I'm hearing you're saying is you need until December of 2022 to decide what will happen, but you need the full 12 months if it's going to be a Bradenhead attachment. In some places, I feel like you're asking for 12 full months. And then in other places, I feel like you're saying it'll all be taken care of by the end of the year. So could you clarify for me?
Sure, absolutely. Sorry about that. The application was filed in December of 2021. And so the request was that we would have the full 12 months to December of 2022 to go out, make the determination, and do the retrofitting such that all of the wells that will be retrofitted where technically feasible will be done by December 2022.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yes,
just was not clicking for me at all.
Yeah, no problem.
I'm wondering if you could address the letter from Larimer, and I realize it's not a protest, but it is a letter saying that it looks to me like one of the wells of concern, you've already added a Bradenhead in between when the letter was written and today. But the other two, 13.1 and 20-3, apparently have not been in production and been TNA'd since the 80s, before the 1980s. And I'm wondering if you could explain to me why you would even want to put a Bradenhead on versus just plugging and abandoning these two locations.
If I can address that, one of the things we're ongoing is trying to do an alternatives analysis as to how we might can make additional investments in the field. And so quite often when we look at the analysis, using an existing wellbore location has less of an impact on the environment and or safety concerns than drilling new wells. And so we've had an ongoing engineering review that was initiated after acquiring the field in March of last year to look at each and every wellbore and understand whether it has continued utility or not. The prior operator was undercapitalized and really just couldn't afford to do much with the field. And so we're looking at the 20-3 and the 13-1 as to their utility. In both cases, the likely conclusion is that we will abandon them, but we want to complete the analysis first.
Thank you.
Commissioner McGowan, I would note for the record that the compliance review from Diana Burns also had that December 31, 2022 date in it. So further questions for the applicant or the witness? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just trying to better understand the timeline, understanding that as I'm reading the information that was in the application, that Wellington received a warning letter, I believe sometime April 2020. King acquired Wellington. I assume King realized that there was a warning letter associated with the wells that they acquired. And I'm trying to reconcile why nothing was done for some amount of time until some work was completed in this year, I guess. So what happened to 2021?
Yes, so work was ongoing almost within 3 months of taking over control of the field. We did the initial first retrofit. there were originally 10 wells that required braided head valves. We've completed 6 of them. Part of that timing issue was initially we did a pilot project around 3 wells to make sure that we could safely and retrofit these wells with confidence. It hadn't been done before, so there was a little bit of experimentation to make sure that we could do it and had comfortable that we could do so. And then there's also planning around the agricultural season. Since the bulk of our wells are within agricultural operations, we generally plan our operations around when we can get on the locations and not disturb the ongoing agricultural operations. So we have been dutifully pursuing retrofitting these wells. It just takes a little bit longer than you might expect because they're not it's not a technically simple operation. We do have to do it when weather conditions are dry and without trying to disrupt our surface owners' operations.
And just to add to Tom's comments, as noted in the application, that warning letter was closed by COGCC staff. COGCC staff had been out to the field, had worked with the previous owner looking at the issues and concerns raised, and requested that Wellington, previous owner, do request this variance application. And so that process had been initiated when King came in.
Thanks for that. Yeah, there was a little bit lacking in information from staff regarding this particular application and a timeline associated with it and information from staff on this particular variance request. And so I appreciate that that explanation. Thank you.
Yeah, Wellington has definitely been diligently working toward ensuring that they can do this and ensuring that they can do it safely.
Other questions? Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate the additional information. Back to the 2 wells that have been temporarily abandoned, you're trying to make a decision whether or not they can go back into production. You will have that determined by the end of the year, and then a commitment from you all either to get it back into production within how long or P&A. And then I was trying to connect with AAG Davenport and trying to remember our own rules. I think after a certain amount of time, you have to decide whether it's going to produce or you're going to fully financially assure the well or P&Aing it. So I'm just wondering if you could talk through your plans for those 2 locations, depending on the outcome of your.
Yeah, I'd like to broaden it a little bit more to the general issue of excess well bores. We've got a number of wells that were, in addition to those 2 that have been temporarily abandoned under a long time period. And so we are doing a review of all the wells in the field as part of our financial assurance planning under the new rules, and with the expectation of having a full-blown plan by the October deadline to understand which wells that we're going to maintain financial assurance on, and which we will plan on abandoning within the 6 months, because of that is the choice with the braided heads, to either install braided heads or abandon within 6 months or seek a variance to continue operations. And then the third category is just to start planning on abandoning those excess wells at a schedule that's makes sense both for ourselves and our surface owners.
Thank you, that's helpful. So will you actually know what you might be doing with these wells as part of your financial assurance plan in October?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's our goal.
Thank you.
Further questions? Deliberation, motion? Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, so in reading the materials and hearing the testimony today, it does seem to me like Wellington has been trying to get to these wells as quickly as they can. They do seem like they're challenging from an access perspective, from an evaluation perspective, from an execution perspective. but it seems like they're moving in the right direction. I'm comfortable with a variance that extends to the end of this year, December 2022. Seems to me as if that is the best route to approach this, given the interaction with staff in the past, starting I think 2019 or 2020 through now. And so I just want to make sure that anyways, I think that those are the right dates, but I think that it's appropriate. I support this variance, and if there's not further discussion, I would move to approve this variance.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second. And then, Mr. Chair, I am going to support this variance request as well, because I think we're going to have more information and better information under the financial assurance plan that will be submitted. And I think that might also be able to answer some questions for Larimer County. And I hope that the county is paying attention, because they can provide testimony for financial assurance plans if they so desire. And I think that when we have wells that have been sitting that long and not producing, we want to make sure we have some sort of plan for them. And so I feel good that the operator is thinking through this and has appropriately addressed my questions for now.
Good heads up to Larimer County. AG Davenport, did you have anything?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to ensure that if there is motion or has been a motion, that it's to grant the variance, that it's to a date certain. In other words, that we clarify when that variance expires.
I had stated December 2022 in my motion, AG Davenport, but I'll specify December 31st, 2022.
Okay, thank you.
I'll second the amended proposal.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Variance is approved. Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, my fellow commissioners, I believe we've come to the conclusion of the agendized business for today. Does anyone have anything further at this time?
Chair, I just wanted to give another thank you to Dr. Edwards for his presentation today on oxylocarbon ventures and then generally answering our questions about how carbon capture, sequestration, storage, utilization works. I had asked Dr. Edwards to give that presentation, and I was appreciative of him being willing to do so today.
Yeah, and I will definitely go back and watch the YouTube video link on that and apologize for not being available this morning. But it's helpful for everyone to know that we've got our meetings are on our YouTube channel, and you can go back and watch them night after night after night if you so desire. All right. With that, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 We're adjourned. Thanks, everybody.